Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond Wakanda. This is Bhakti Shringarpure from Radical Books Collective, and here's Ainehi Edoro from Brittle Paper. We are so excited to bring you this brilliant event with 5 exciting authors from the African continent, and all of them have just published these super cool books. So, and we are really grateful to have partnered with Brittle Paper and made this possible. And today we, Warscapes / Radical Books Collective will live stream from YouTube. Brittle Paper is live streaming this event on Facebook. And Africa as a Country is helping us out by live streaming this on Twitter. So thanks everybody for joining. Our wonderful, talented sci-fi, fantasy, young adult, dystopic, apocalyptic, great authors of speculative fiction are all in the studio. So I'm just going to beam them up and they can just say a quick hi.
Hi, I'm Courttia. I'm joining from London.
Hi, I'm Wanjiku. I'm joining from Atlanta, Georgia.
Wonderful.
Hi, I'm Tendai. I'm joining from Edinburgh.
Siphiwe joining from Johannesburg.
And this is Efua joining from Germany.
And oops, sorry. And then it was Lizzy who's going to do the interview.
Hi, I'm joining from South London.
Thank you so much, everybody. This is super exciting for us to come from so many places. Meg Arenberg was also supposed to be here, but she had a different time issue. So I want to start us off with Ainehi. You recorded something. What did you?
Yes, so I got together with Wole Talabi. Wole is the official archivist for the African Speculative Fiction Society, and he's actually one of the founding members. It's a fascinating organization, and they've done a lot to consolidate and organize the production, publication of speculative fiction around a community. And I got to talk to him. He's based in Malaysia, so of course, it was a little trying to get us in a time zone that made sense for both of us. But we eventually met each other and we got to just talk about what African speculative fiction is really doing, what it means to think about a genre that is trying to kind of unthink lots of the traditional ways in which we've always thought about African storytelling. And what you're going to see is an excerpt from that conversation that Bhakti and her team have sort of, put together in a way that looks lovely.
Thanks, Ainehi. I'm going to beam it up. It was a 40-minute conversation, and hopefully we can do something with that, Ainehi, because it was so exciting for me to hear all of it and learn so much. But for now, we're playing the first 24 minutes, and I think there's lots to learn. Thank you, everyone. Everyone will join. There's a schedule in your links, so follow that for your favorite writers and put in your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube. The Twitter ones don't come in, so Facebook and YouTube, please. All right, let me share screen.
Hello, Wole. How are you?
Very good. Hi. Good to talk to you.
Great. Same here as well. So this is Wole Talabi. He is a henchman, let me put it that way, in the African speculative fiction universe. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your work?
My name is Wole Talabi. I am a writer and an engineer in reverse order. And yeah, most of my work centers around speculative fiction, which is something I've been fascinated in since I was a child, and especially on science fiction in particular, and what it has to say about the relationship between humans and technology, but also fantasy as well. And I think I would describe myself as someone that's interested in the entire continuum of the fantastic, right? all the different elements of fantastic literature are things that I gravitate towards. I like reading and I like writing.
Okay, great. I mean, you're already bringing up things that we are going to hopefully get to when we talk. I am Ainehi Edoro. I am a literature professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and where I teach African literature and digital culture. I am also the editor of Brittle Paper. It's a platform for African literature. So today, myself and Wole are going to talk about speculative fiction within the African context. And I'm delighted to talk to Wole particularly about this because you are a writer. Yes, you are a practitioner of the form, but you also kind of exist in the cultural, infrastructural world of speculative fiction. You are part of the African Speculative Fiction Society.
Yep.
Can you tell us a bit about this organization?
Right. So the African Speculative Fiction Society is a group of writers, editors, publishers, other practitioners in the speculative literary scene. And by literary, I mean the expansive sense, including comics and all that, who got together between 2015 and 2016 with the mission to promote the image of African speculative fiction globally, as there was a lot of increased interest and we wanted to take some control of the narrative, how African speculative fiction would be perceived. So we got together, we put together a charter in order to clarify, who do we consider as African? How would we promote works? How would we try to archive and record works that are going on? How do we honor certain works? In one of the things that we did was set up the normal awards, which are given out every year for best African speculative novel, short story, novella, and graphic novel or comic. And in addition to that, we work with other similar bodies outside of Africa. So like the Science Fiction Writers of America, the British Fiction Society. We work with them and interact with them to ensure that, Africans are represented and included in any global speculative fiction events, and essentially just advocate on behalf of the African speculative fiction scene. And one of the key elements that we had in mind when we set up the African Speculative Fiction Society was also to promote the homegrown, continent-based base, I would say, of African speculative fiction, which means promotes the readership, the writership, reviews, critical reviews, critical engagement with the works, and promote reading as well, overall. So that's essentially what the ASFS does. And I'm happy to be one of the first members of that.
Oh, really?
I actually came up with the name. So yes, the name was my
African
suggestion.
Speculative Fiction Society. It sounds very grand, by the way. I know. It's like very,
I like grand, and we're speculative fiction writers. We like epic fantasy.
Yeah.
Space opera. We like big and epic.
Yes. So how long has the organization been in operation?
Since about 2015.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So about 6 years now.
Okay, I see. And you mentioned the word advocacy. Why would we need to advocate for African speculative fiction? Because it appears to me that you're gesturing towards some kind of problem that you guys are trying to intervene and forestall.
So it's more to say advocate in the sense that, generally speaking, in the science fiction, fandom, literary spaces, Africa has historically not been represented, unfortunately. It's a similar story you hear in many other respects. But with the speculative and science fictional spaces in particular, Africa is usually excluded. And that is something that we wanted to help address, right? And bring Africa into focus as a world, African speculative fiction as a core part of the world speculative fiction literature. So that was one of the main things we wanted to advocate for. And at the same time, the other hand of that was not just advocating to the so-called established global science or speculative environment, but also to gesture back on the continent to a lot of young writers who think that speculative fiction, or especially in particular science fiction, so this is something we might discuss later, in particular science fiction, we have lots of young writers on the continent who think it's not for them because they think advanced technology, future is not really an African thing, even though it very much is and it always has been. And that is something we wanted to try to correct and kind of encourage those of them that were already doing it and show them that there is a path to do it successfully and find readership and find publication and move on into the larger literary space.
I see. So, I mean, let's talk about that, fantasy, sci-fi within the African context. You just said that, it's always been there in the archive, in the history. So can we talk about what the history of an African speculative fiction might look like, bearing in mind that there could be multiple starting points? But let's just, think, how would you tell the story of this form?
Okay, so if I tried to tell the story of African speculative fiction, and bear in mind, this is entirely my own invention and way of looking at things, I would say you could split it into five sort of eras, right? The first one being the broadest, which is pre-1930.
Okay.
And 1930, what you have is a rich oral tradition, a rich religious tradition, a rich storytelling tradition that includes everything. And in many African storytelling traditions, the fantastic is part of the story.
Okay.
It is taken for granted. If you ask almost anyone that grew up as a child, what kind of folk tales did they hear? Did their grandparents tell them? Did their great-grandparents tell them about? It almost always involves some sort of fable, some sort of fantastical element, which, leans a bit more towards fantasy, but some of them are actually science fictional if you think about it. They're technological concepts, right? Stories about how the tortoise made something that he could use to climb to heaven, right? Not science fiction in the strictest sense, but definitely along the realm of the fantastic.
In a technological sense. Can I just butt in here?
Yeah.
That thinking about science technologically is fascinating, right? Because somebody like Shoinka has written a lot about Ogun, right? And how Ogun is tied to metallurgy and iron as a technology for literally cutting the forest down so that civilizations can emerge. So Ogun is a certain kind of figure of technology as a sign of the future. And then I remember reading, it's called the Umwendo Epic by the Nyanga people. And one of the characteristics of the hero is that he has to go about with this metal iron implements that he invented and that he uses to, do all the cool stuff he does in the world. So I just want to kind of buttress your point that technology as ways of imagining possible futures is something that has always been within the African literature.
Exactly. Now, the reason I try to highlight, having a technological lens is essentially still fantastical or fantasy, is because science fiction itself is a relatively new genre.
Right.
It has certain tenets of it that are very much tied to when it was created, which is, related to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, Americas, and thinking specifically about extrapolating from current scientific and technological things that exist, extrapolating from that into what could exist. So it's very much focused. It's very much originating as a Western concept, right? The definition of science fiction. Doesn't mean it cannot be expanded, but those kind of technologically grounded stories do exist in folktales, and you find them, and some of them are actually very detailed, especially when it comes to things like metalworking, woodworking to create certain tools. You find elements of all these in stories. So you could even consider them to some extent science fictional, right? Even if not strictly science fiction. Right. So all these elements, they're wide, they're varied, everything from, Efua divination to stories about the hare and the tortoise and everything in between. Now, as from the 1930s, you start to see, a kind of formalized literature where you have certain people writing down these stories or writing down versions of them. So talking again about forests, you have like D.O. Fagunwa's Forest of 1,000 Demons, which Shoyinka translated. I can't read the original Yoruba, but Shoyinka translated in the 60s, right? And that's probably one of the early examples. There might be others, but then you also have, Amos Tutuola also writing down essentially a collage of folklores and stories that he had with, So you have those. You also start to see things like fictionalized versions of colonial encounters that include fantastical elements, even science fictional elements, like Nanga Khan is an example from Cameroon.
What is that?
It's a book by a Cameroonian author whose name I think is Jean-Louis Medu.
Okay.
Louis Medu, yeah. That's also from 19. It's from the 30s. And then you have Gandoki.
Yes.
Right, which is also by Mohamed Kagara. Right. So you start to see these things
in Hausa.
Yes, originally written in Hausa, yeah. So you start to see these, these two versions of like written down folklore, as well as fictionalized versions of colonial encounters from the last few centuries based on their actual experiences, start to become written down into stories that become popular and are circulated and read. Does that kind of the pre-literature era. And then, so those are the first two. And then if I go to the next stage, I would say you have between the 60s and the 90s, you essentially have the general African literary fiction canon. But what happens is speculative fiction is just lumped in with everything else. There's no formal separation of African speculative fiction. So you have, Buchi Echemeta, Kojolan, Benokri, Flora Nwapa. They're all writing stories that are well received, that are widely read, Cyprian Ekwensi. These stories are all there. They are very clearly speculative fiction stories, but they just taken to be part of the African literary canon. Okay. But there's no attempt to really separate them into something else. So you have that era, and it's a successful era. I mean, Benokri is still writing his wonderful things since then. And then you kind of have the 2000s,
right,
where you start to see African speculative fiction separate itself a bit, right? Become more of a separate genre. And in my opinion, I'm not an academic, I'm not a scholar, but in my opinion, what seems to have happened is you have the convergence of several things. You have the convergence of the internet, the globalization of the world. So a lot more children in Africa grew up watching similar things as children everywhere else. You have the ubiquitousness of blogs and blogging. So more people writing without having to go through a formal publishing infrastructure. So they're free to write whatever they want. Digital publishing really taking off. You have Nnedi Okorafor really kind of coming into our own during this period, the mid 2000s. You have District 9, Neil Blomkamp's District 9, which comes out and it's a big hit, but it's a very, very African science fiction movie, but produced with Hollywood, you know, with the endorsement of Hollywood essentially, and it becomes a global hit. You have Lauren Bukis writing her own cyberpunk South Africa as well during this period, and that taking off, and she wins a few awards and the popularity grows. So you have the convergence of all these things, kind of, you know, a series of inspirations, you know, successful people, the first few successful people coming out as obviously genre, not writers who just happen to write something speculative. They are speculative fiction writers.
Right.
Becoming successful, the ubiquitousness of the internet, globalization, a wider science fictional community. And then in the global context, you also have the Western, for lack of a better term, the Western science fictional community coming into several of its own struggles. So there was what we call a Race Fail 2009, which is a whole saga I wasn't even aware of until fairly recently. A few years ago, I found out. But in 2009, you know, there was a sequence or a series of discussions about representativeness of race and recognition of other cultures and acceptance and appreciation in the global science fictional community. And them kind of coming to terms and realizing that, you know, they're not actually as global as they thought. So all of that. And of course, you also have things like Afro SF and Ivor Hartman publishing under, I think it was called African Raw, publishing science fiction, speculative fiction, all of that. So yeah, you have all these things converging to kind of form a crucible or a pot, let's say, kind of cooking things and a few things bubbling to the surface. And that's really what I would say spawned the modern African speculative fiction scene as we know it. There is a kind of fifth phase that I'm seeing now. I think I'm seeing, I might be imagining things. But
it's okay to imagine. We're talking about science fiction.
Exactly, yeah. My imagination. I'm also an engineer. I'm very used to trying to trace patterns and things. But I do see since post Black Panther, the response in America and globally to African imaginings, let's put it that way, has become stronger and broader. So whereas the previous phase I talked about was more about, it was like a slow build of many things kind of coming together and building up. Post Black Panther, there's been almost an explosion.
Thank you. I mean, I've always thought that it was in my head, you know? I feel like there is this explosion of speculative fiction in the African space, and that it's a reflection of an interest in Western publishing. It's like everybody is trying to, you know, get the next big African speculative fiction writer. So that is actually happening.
Yeah, I see it. I see the responses. It's positive. I would say it's mostly positive because it's giving, well, African writers who have been writing or who have just started writing, there is wider interest in their work, and there's more opportunities. So that's definitely there. There's also a bit of, at least on my part, I am cautiously optimistic about it. And the caution comes from the aspect of control, which is when someone's interested in something you're doing, they do have some measure of control on how they choose to be interested in it. So when you're talking about, Western publishers, filmmakers, TV producers, they control the budget. They control the logistics. They largely control many aspects of the way these stories will be received. So there is a risk that African speculative fiction will change itself in order to fit
the expectations of this market forces. Yes. I see.
Correct.
Go on.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things I have noticed with this, which is a broader conversation, and I think it's something Nnedi is trying to address, is there seems to be a bit of push-pull in order to change the definition of African to Black.
Interesting.
And the two are obviously related, right? There's no question about that. They're related as much as any two siblings will ever be, but they're not the same, right? African is very much historical, geographical, cultural, and Black is race. It's a race thing, right? So there's an element of that going on. Again, I think partially driven by the US and interest from the US.
Where everything gets sort of sucked into this massive category of Black, right? I suppose acknowledging that there are different Blacknesses and not all of them are constituted by race as something constructed in the West. Or that there are other kinds of Blacknesses that aren't imagining itself in relation to whiteness as its other.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly.
And so, I mean, people have been conflicted about Nnedi Okorafor's campaign, which is embodied in her introduction of the term African futurism.
Yep.
Right? So, you seem to be sort of in her camp to the extent that you see that term as helpful.
I do.
Right?
Yes. I think, yes, I see it as helpful. But again, every term, yes, I think helpful is the right term. I see it as helpful. I am not attached to it in the sense that, I will insist that things have to be labeled a certain way.
Right, yeah.
If it is labeled that way, in a certain context, I will support it because it helps readers to understand, writer intent, and certain things that they should be on the lookout for. And that could change their experience of reading certain works. And that's another thing I think, I don't know if I differ so much with Nnedi on this, but one thing I am very clear about is that to me, a person is not African futurist. A work is.
Thank you so much, Ainehi and Wole Talabi. That was, as Tendai is saying, a very strong start to our heavy load of African fiction, speculative fiction works. I'm going to invite now Wanjiku Ngugi into the studio to talk about her wonderful, beautiful Welcome. Seasons in HIPPOLAND. So let me just say a little bit about, just give a little bio, and then maybe you'll read a little from the book just to give us a little taste.
Sure, sounds good.
Thank you. So Wanjiku and Ngugi, so happy you could join. So Wanjiku wears many different hats. She's a journalist and a political analyst who's written for many different outlets. She actually did her bachelor's in political science, but then did an MFA in creative writing. And what's interesting, of course, is to see the amount of countries she's lived in: Kenya, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, the United States. And the one I find most curious, of course, is Finland, where where you started the Helsinki African Film Festival. She writes plays as well as novels. Her first novel, The Fall of Saints, was published in 2014. And she's just published Seasons in HIPPOLAND with Seagull Books. I'll put a link in the chat for everyone to go get a copy. It was literally is fresh off the press. So congratulations on your second book. I loved reading it, partially because I know it's set in a fictitious place, but it felt very much like Nairobi, and it felt a lot like so that's okay. We don't, we want to keep its universality, of course.
Yeah.
But I want to start by asking you to tell our viewers what this novel is about, and then maybe you can read for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, this novel is about storytelling. So Mombi, a young, it's a coming of age story, really. And it starts off, Mombi is pretty young and she's rebellious. So her parents send her off to HIPPOLAND to learn a few lessons, learn about life. And obviously, her and her brother are not interested in being there, but they soon discover that their aunt tells, and is a master storyteller, and she tells stories, infuses them with fantasy and magic, and actually brings them to life. So the opposite happens. So they start wanting to be in HIPPOLAND, and obviously this affects how Mombi grows up and who she becomes sort of in the future, in a nutshell.
Wow, very nice. Yeah, and it's a beautiful read, though it also has a lot of very dark elements. There seems to be a dictatorship and some soldiers, and then eventually imprisonment for storytelling. So where are you going to read us from?
Right. So from a really dark, no, I'm kidding. I'm just going to read a small excerpt. So when Mombi and her brother meet or go to HIPPOLAND, obviously the aunt tells them stories in the evening, as I mentioned, but then during the day they sort of wander out and explore. So I'm just going to read a really short piece about how Mombi gets lost in a train, or rather they're exploring the train, and then it leaves the station and Mombi is left in the train. So she has to then travel to Londonshire, which is another town away from HIPPOLAND by herself. And then she remembers her aunt telling them the stories about how she was lost on a train. Mm-hmm. And then I'll just read now. Keep it really short. I have no ticket. I have no money with which I can buy a ticket, and I'm all alone. So now, like Sarah, I'm in a train all alone. Sarah was 7. I'm slightly more than her age. She had a ticket. I don't. I want my heart to slow down so it could help me control the fear filling up my lungs, making my legs and my arms and then my whole body feel as heavy as stone. Fear has weight. Fear is a rock. Fear is a mountain. I close my eyes and try to breathe calmly, to focus on my arms and legs, to move them a little up and down and side to side, as Aunt Sarah had taught me once, to help quell the fear, to shift the energy from my heart to my limbs, then from inside me to somewhere outside. I keep my eyes closed and breathe and feel the train latch on and on and on until it finally stops. I open my eyes, I get up, I stagger outside onto the platform. But I'm in Londonshire. But am I in Londonshire now, or back in Londonshire then? My head spins and my tummy clenches. The soldiers, the green berets, they're here on the platform, right in front of me, pacing up and down, looking at the passengers. The Green Berets march Sarah and Rose off to a room behind the station. I follow. A stale smell hits me as soon as I walk in. A fan spins loudly. The white paint on the walls is peeling off in strips. In the middle of the cement floor is a wooden table. To the side, a set of drawers. Next to it, a wooden bench. Sarah is made to sit there and watch Rose as she stands in front of the table, looking at the Green Beret. I watch Sarah watching Rose, watching the Green Beret man. The room is cold. Rose's eyes are full of fear, but she answers as calmly as she can every question that is barked out at her. Then the Green Beret stands up, tells Rose and Sarah to follow him, and takes them out the back door to yet another room where more Green Berets are marching up and down and saluting the portrait of a queen they'll actually never meet. They march in 2 columns. The columns stop when Rose and Sarah arrive. Sarah is made to stand aside. Rose stands in front of the soldiers. At a sign from the tall man, the Green Berets stick out their lugers and point them straight at Rose. Then the tall man comes to Sarah and hands her a pistol. It's too big for her to hold, but he forces her little hands around it. The gun was so cold, so heavy. The tall man drags her to her feet, makes her stand in front of her mother, and points the gun at her. He lifts her hands to make sure the gun is in line with her mother's heart. Sarah does not want to look at her mother. She closes her eyes tight. She hears the men laughing. The tall man presses her finger on the trigger. It hurts because he's pressing so hard. She's determined to never open her eyes again, not even when the man pushes her finger even harder and the gun makes a loud click. She stands there, deaf and dumb and blind. 1 minute, 2 minutes, a lifetime. That's it.
Thank you. Beautiful. Very lyrical. I'm going to dive into my first question for you, which might seem a little silly, but there's a real ecological, environmental, there's a real sense of place there every time Mito and Mumbi go to Hippoland, their aunt's home, their ancestral home. I just wanted to know, why hippos? Why this animal? Was that mean something?
Well, I mean, I guess first of all, to your point about, I did want to highlight in this book that colonialism, as we understand it, didn't disrupt people's lives. It disturbed a whole entire ecosystem. So that's important. In terms of hippos, specifically, it's because I lived in a place near marshland, which is actually called HIPPOLAND, And my brother Mokoma and I used to make clay. We used to make clay and pot in this marshland, and because we thought we could try to sell these pots, which unfortunately broke down as soon as they dried up. But then my brother was just reminding me the other day that we would actually find shrapnel, would find remnants, bones and skulls of hippos, So I mean, I think that's why I chose that. It's also an ode to this marshland, which was destroyed when they built a butter shoe factory right next to it.
Wow.
Yeah, so disturbing, like really just destroying the environment around there. But it's just representative of
right,
the system.
right. I think what you're saying is that we continue to exist in a kind of colonial present, even though technically it's supposed to be in the past. So maybe we can get to the question of history or colonial history that you're trying to get at in your in Seasons of Hippoland. So the novel centers silenced or erased histories of a dictatorship, of violence, and these soldiers who engage in terrible activities and imprison people. These are sort of dark historical currents that could apply to a post-colonial country, really. And I just wanted to know why you chose to go with a fantasy or a young adult genre novel to uncover this. Why did you pick this style?
Right. So I don't know if it's. That's been interesting to me. I wonder if because it's quite also dark, but it's I mean, I think that because it's told from Mombi's point of view, and I did try to sort of retain her voice when she's young, so it kind of feels like it could be read, it could be YA in that sense, but then she's also quite exposed to sort of the brutality that colonialism was and neocolonialism, because they do live in the country they live in is ruled by an emperor who calls himself the Emperor for Life, And yeah, the characters, Mombi and her brother, dwell in a present that's definitely haunted by the past, even as they try to imagine possibilities for a future. But you know, sometimes I think that writing fantasy and or adding magical elements to this, to a novel, to a story, is kind of a way of searching for the truth. It's like sometimes the truth, like the stuff that has happened in Kenya, where I'm from, for instance, is almost sometimes is unbelievable. It's like, you know, it's like almost, it's fantastic, you know. So I think that sometimes adding magical elements to stories, to novels, helps, and juxtaposing them, or, you know, putting reality and juxtaposing it with magical elements, helps you dig at the truth, you know. And then you know, I did grow, and I wanted to talk about meaning making and resistance, freedom, identity, you know, agency, and so on and so forth. And so I wanted to talk about the role of storytelling in a way through, obviously, fiction and myth making for survival, not only at the micro scale of family, Mombi's family, but on the macro scale of the nation. And I think it allowed, you know, I mean, I think using using magic or telling the story the way I did sort of allows me to sort of poke at, you know, some of the things that these governments do, or how they present. I mean, for instance, right now we live in a world where there's such a thing as like alternative facts. Like, what in the world does that even mean? But we
fake news, alternative facts.
Right, like what is that, you know? But yeah. So I think so. That's what I wanted to get at. The other thing I do want to add is so my brother and I were growing up in Mokoma. We had an aunt, actually Sarah, who told us stories, you know, stories, and we wanted these stories whenever she came to visit. That's all we wanted to do. We couldn't wait for the evening so she could tell us the stories. And they were all like, you know, like what I was talking about earlier. They were just rooted in, they were always fantastic. There was always magic in them. But that's what kept us glued to those stories, is their fantastic elements. But it's the kind of stories that always have like, this is to teach you, sort of like the moralist or whatever, you know. But they kept us glued. And I thought it would be interesting to play around with the magic of what I felt when my aunt was telling us these stories. And into a book. I thought it would be fun too. It was kind of
yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that this aunt is sort of based on somebody, you know, on someone you knew, because when I read it, and maybe I was over analyzing it, but I thought that centering the aunt had something to do also with engaging, you know, some sort of a critique there about the parents in the book as well, because you know, Mumbi is very rebellious and she gets sent away because she's caught. Is she caught smoking? Yes.
Yeah, it's just smoking, but yeah.
she's basically badass, and she's exiled. And I thought the relationship with her father in particular was strained, and I was just interested in the figure of the aunt. You know, we always get a lot about mothers and fathers and parental figures, and I just thought, you know, why did you choose an aunt to pass this on, or, you know?
Yeah, I think I just wanted also to, because so Mombi's parents are lawyers, right? And they're good people in the sense that they are trying to help people sort of fight against the government, or sort of defending the people who are victims of the current regime, right? So, but in the process, they forget to actually be parents to their kids. So the kids are quite neglected, you know? So Mombi is not rebellious in the sense of she's seeking some sort of attention, you know? And so, right. So she goes, so the reason she sort of clings to her aunt is not only that attention, but her aunt helps her understand the world in the way that her parents don't, because their parents are so focused on keeping them safe, in the sense that they don't let them watch the news, or they don't, whatever it is they do to think that, okay, we need to keep you away from this brutality, right? So we're going to build this very secure little world for you, and you will not understand what's going on, even though they're affected by the things that are going on clearly, you know. They do live in the world, they do have friends, they do go to school, they do, you know, and so on and so forth. But, you know, they go to their aunt, who then explains the world to them and tells them, okay, this is how it is. And part of the reason that they stick, or they love their aunts, they love her stories, is because she helps them make meaning. She tells them, she helps them sort of connect the dots so that they can understand, which is, I think, is important for continuity, and to understand how the past affects the present.
Yeah. You know, I'm not someone who has read a ton of speculative fiction, but I do watch a lot of movies of that. You know, I have kids the age where we're all watching like Marvel movies and so on. So, you know, I wondered, even Fall of Saints is a genre book in a way. It's also playing with like a popular genre of crime, thriller, and so on. And then this one is also, you know, that sort of work with magical elements. So, you know, what are sort of the influences or writers, films that you're drawing from?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially for this book. So, well, let me start with the Fall of Saints. I think that when we were younger, because there was so much storytelling going on around us, and there was this one story that was circulating in my family that my dad told, and then my siblings were telling Mukama and I. And, you know, it was always about this character who was in search of justice, you know. So I think Fall of Saints is kind of sort of modeled after that, because it was such a huge influence when we were growing up. But to talk about Seasons in HIPPOLAND, the reason why I mean, I think that, let me think about that for a minute. I think that because my aunt told us these stories, and because we were so captivated by these stories, and because they had such meaning for us, then I thought that, then it made sort of sense in that way. It was really just about recreating that magical childhood that right. I think, and it's hard to.
And are there any films or books or something that?
Right. Yeah. So yeah. To get back to that, because I was getting lost. I mean, of course, I've read Gashiamake's, you know. I think I've read 100 Years of Solitude quite a few times in my life, and Love in a Time of Cholera. I'm just about to read Autumn of the Patriarch. You know, so I think there is some influence there. Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie, you know. When I first read that book, it was just fascinating to me because it gave me an insight, I think, in a different kind of way into India and what was happening, or what he was talking about, in sort of like a different, you know, give me a different entry point, you know. It also allows you to talk about like really magical realism, I should have said, also allows you to talk about like some really dark things, you know, because it's, you know, weaved in with the element of magic. It doesn't feel as dark or didactic, for that matter.
Sure. I mean, you know, of course, the book transported me to certain neighborhoods in Nairobi and so on, because I was there for a couple of years. But it also very much seemed like the current Indian moment, with what Modi is doing in terms of anybody who says anything, reports anything, they're just imprisoned. It's really bad right now. And it was interesting, of course, that the book was also published by Naveen Kishore, who is based in India, in Seagull Books. So I like that kind of post-colonial thread that it draws. I'm going to ask you a personal question, because you mentioned Salman Rushdie, and Salman, I had once attended an event where he was talking, and he said that his son could not be could not be in a bigger hurry to go as far as possible from his father's profession, which was writing and literature. But you know, but of course, you are the daughter of legendary writer that we all read and revere, and then your siblings, of course, are also writing. You mentioned Mukoma. I mean, is this anxiety provoking or is this freeing? I just wondered, is this kind of stressful to enter this line?
And I don't think that it is. I think that because we all tell stories, we're such different writers anyway. But I have to say though, in the beginning, there was some sort of anxiety because there was always the, not a fear, but sort of like, you just wonder if you'd get compared to it. I don't know. I think a younger me would have definitely sort of maybe wondered about that. But I'm older. I think we all have stories to tell, and like I said, there are so many stories out in the world. We write so differently. I think that it's
Yeah, it might be a testament to being encouraged to do it, as opposed to in Rushdie's family, something else might have been going on. We don't know. So you never know. So this book is out and about. What is next for you? What are you working on? What's happening?
Another novel. I've also been writing short stories, and I'm really have gotten into this magical realism. So I'm doing that in short stories as well, but working on another novel.
Okay. Yeah. And that's soon, in a way, like it's going to come soon, or
not that soon. Okay. I'm still in the I'm still sort of I'm in the beginnings. I think I've like just a couple of drafts in, so there's a bit more work to go in.
Yeah.
Hopefully soon, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good luck with that. But you're currently joining us from Atlanta in the US, but you have this history with Scandinavia, with Helsinki, starting a film festival there. What's happening there with African writing, African culture? Why did you start this festival?
Just because I was living in Finland at the time, and I'd visited Finland at the time. I have family ties. My daughter was born in Finland, so I wasn't too happy about how I thought Africans were represented. So I thought, why not have Africans actually tell their own stories and have these fiends come and we can have dialogue about this, and I think there was also space. There wasn't enough representation. I didn't think it was, and when it was there, I think it wasn't. I don't know. Wasn't well done, I think, or it wasn't fair. It was just a different lens of looking at this diverse African continent. And I guess my job was to sort of reconstruct these stories that have been going on in Finland, deconstruct them and then reconstruct them, but that was the reason. That was really basically why, and because I love African film, and
yeah
and, it was also
So it's still going on. It happens, the film festival.
It didn't happen this year. Hopefully it'll happen. Yeah. I'm not attached to the festival, but
oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I thought you might still be, but so basically, we just heard from Wole Talabi and Ainehi Edoro, where they were saying that there's a big push suddenly with publishers, and I think even with film, with speculative fiction narratives coming out of the African continent or of African heritage. And part of it was because of Black Panther and what the film did. My sense wasn't that your work is located in that timeline. I think you've been doing it before Black Panther. And I think just a kind of final question for you would be, what do you think is going on? What is the current trend? Just because we have all these writers in the studio today talking about sci-fi, fantasy, young adult, dystopic works. And I just wondered, what's your sense of the scene, or are we seeing a trend? Where do you think it's headed?
Yeah, I think to start with, I think what Wole said before is like, we've kind of been writing speculative fiction in different forms. We just haven't highlighted it. So I welcome the, and also like sometimes, especially in the West, African novels, African fiction has been viewed through the lens of only realistic fiction, as if that's the only fiction that can render the truth, if you like, or that you can explore possibilities of digging or finding the truth, or that exploring whatever wants to explore. And I think it's just like, so it's good that the space is opening up. I do feel like it's opening up. I do feel like other writers who are not necessarily writing realistic fiction are also getting the platform to say what they want to say and to write the kind of books they want to write. And I think so. I think as African writers, I think we should, like everybody else, be sort of allowed to write what we want to write.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you one last question because we have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
These are questions I logged as silly questions, but I'm interested in them. In your book, there's the porcelain bowl.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought it to be so beautiful. Do you know where in your imagination this came from? The idea of a porcelain bowl?
I don't know, but but I like what it represents. But I and in my mind, it's also
what
like,
does it represent?
But it represents the stories that we have that we're yet to tell, that we should be telling. It sort of also represents history that we are not allowed to tell, that we should be telling, because what happens, the stories that the empire is trying to actually bans storytelling, and then decides to write history, says we need to correct, all the falsehoods that the stories are telling. So we need to write history, and we need to ban storytelling. So like the porcelain bowl is just symbolic for for storytelling, for myth, for resistance, like I said earlier, meaning making, and yeah, I think that's what it's just symbolic. Yeah,
it's symbolic. Okay, that's that's great. There's a lot of symbolism, and I think it really becomes a great insight into censorship. And I think it's not a hard read for young people, but it's definitely challenging. But at the same time, so I feel like there's a mixed audience for it, which I think makes it quite interesting. I think it works for an adult. You're being told something, but then I think it could work for young adults. But I think in the end, you're writing for adults. Am I right? Or
I mean, so yeah, like I'm thinking about my 12-year-old daughter, and she hasn't read this novel, and she's quite a reader. So I haven't let her. Maybe I need to rethink it. I don't know. I just, I'm not sure.
Yeah. No, I think teenagers could definitely read.
Absolutely.
I think before that is a different thing. To me, the style felt very fluid and easy and beautiful to read. The pages moved very fast, but then the content clashed a bit with that. So I wonder how you formulated the audience.
Yeah,
but I think it's great. So we are going to move to the next. This is Seasons in HIPPOLAND. Everybody, please buy your copy from Seagull Books. It's fresh off the press, hot off the press, as they call it. Thank you, Wanjiku Ngugi, for joining us today. And we will move to Lizzy Attree. I'm going to add her to the stream.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Lovely. Hi, Lizzy. You're ready to talk to Courttia and
Yes.
Siphiwe?
Yes, I am.
Are they here? Let's. I'm going to hold up their books. Here's Courttia now. I'm going to add him.
Yeah, I've got the book.
COSMOGRAMMA. And hopefully Siphiwe will show up. I'm going to hand over the reins to you, Lizzy, and I will add Siphiwe when she shows up, because I think there she is. All right. Goodbye.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bhakti, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, Courttia and Siphiwe. I'm so glad that schedules will allow, now that we've worked all the time zones out. And hopefully Eskom will also allow in Johannesburg no load shedding, please, for the next hour or 45 minutes, which is what we have. So I'll just do a brief introduction to both of you and also to myself. So my name is Lizzy Attree. I have been the director of the Kane Prize for a number of years, but in the last 3 years, I've now working for Short Story Day Africa as their UK director on their board, and I am on the board of Wasafiri Writing Magazine. I also teach literature at Richmond, which is an American university in London, and I have a part-time job at a literary agency. So I do a lot of different things. At the moment, in particular, Short Story Day Africa is the project closest to my heart. So I just want to show you probably the reason I've been linked to the African speculative fiction area at the moment is because of this collection, Disruption, which was a collection of stories partly about climate change, but also about the changes that we're all experiencing and the sort of the future uncertainty, all of which coincided with COVID, of course, which led to massive disruption globally. And I think for the first time in a long time, there's a feeling that we're all kind of becoming this kind of more global, not quite in the Star Trek sense, but we're being united by this prospect of what does the future hold for mankind, or womankind, I should say, humankind. And I think what's really interesting about both of your books is they give us different ways to think about not only the past, I think perhaps with Siphiwe's book, but also different ways of imagining the present and the future in Courttia's work. So I hope you can enjoy this kind of conversation with me. And we'll talk about both of your recent work. We're linking this to the Beyond Wakanda moment. So I've got questions about Black Panther that I might drop in there. But first of all, let's just mention that from Courttia's side, he has written 8 books. And this collection, COSMOGRAMMA, is a collection of short stories. So there's about, is it 20 in total in the?
I think about 15.
Oh, is it 15? Okay, 15. I get mixed up with my collection with 21 and 15 stories, and all of which are quite different. Although I was just getting excited today, and as I got to the last story, that I can see a link there between the first and the last, which I love. And you're also famous for having recently written the screenplay for some of Steve McQueen's Small Axe productions, which I have to say, especially Lovers Rock, some of the best television I've seen in a long time. I was out on Spotify trying to find the songs, especially the rewind and everything. So
thank you so much.
That was fantastic to see. And of course, your recent novel, A River Called Time, was also kind of in the speculative genre, a lengthy book that sort of takes us into a world that also involves kind of astral projection and the movement between different spirits, different lifetimes and histories, which I found fascinating too. Siphiwe, your book, The Theory of Flight, is one of a trilogy. So I hear there are 2 more books on the way, which is exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing how you manage to link together different stories and strands through that. The Theory of Flight is it won the Barry Wrong Prize for debut fiction in South Africa. And you have been living in Johannesburg. You were a teacher, is that right? But you've also been achieving a PhD in modern thought and literature from Stanford University in the US. Originally, obviously, from Zimbabwe, from Bulawayo. It's very exciting to see such an accomplished work for a debut novel, particularly when we get into discussing it, when I'm thinking about, taking on such a vast period of history, but also subject matter in a kind of light-hearted, but also quite deep and disturbing way, especially when you address Gukuruhundi and things like that in Matabeleland. So let's start with a more fun question about Black Panther. I'm assuming you both saw the film, is that right?
Yeah.
And what did you think? Siphiwe's laughing. Let's start with you, Siphiwe. What do you think?
I remember because I saw it when I was a teacher, and I remember taking students to go see it because it was this huge event and everyone wanted to be part of it. And I remember, you know, trying to be, you know, the next day in class, trying to like do this. It's great, but let's be critical as well. And the students were like, no, we're not going to do that. This is the best thing ever. And so I really enjoyed it. I really liked what it did. And I like sort of like the universe that it created and it thought up, you know. I really like that. I was wondering though if it was sort of like enough, and I think I wasn't allowed to ask that in the class, but I really did enjoy watching it, and I really just, yeah, it was a great movie.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. It was the same in London. I went to see it in East London, and it was a, you know, really packed movie theater, and everyone was saying hello to each other, and everyone was dressed up, and you know, it's like we'd gone to a party. And I remember at the end of the film, you know, they had that Marvel moment where, you know, the credits are going and stuff, and everybody's walking out, and then they have that final scene where they cut back to the action, you know, and everyone was just like shh. And everyone stopped, even if you're walking out, and they just waited to hear what you had to say. I've never seen that in a Marvel movie before at the end. And yeah, people really treated it with a sense of gravity. I think for me, I mean, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was great. I had a great time. I loved the event of it. But we know, you know, working in the field, even before my book wasn't out at that time, you know, I was writing speculative fiction, and I'd written a bit of my novel, but I was also reading for such a long time. We knew that was just the tip of the iceberg. We knew that there was so much more beneath that. There were so many more stories to be told, and I think that's part of my critique anyway. Is that okay? So what about the rest? Yeah, you've seen it. It makes money. You see people are interested. What about the floodgates? When are they going to open? And but yeah, I thought it was great.
Yeah, I think there was definitely like kind of a global euphoria about the moment of the film and what it meant.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely, it was sort of like that proof that you can have a black superhero, the black lead, that you can introduce the sort of technology aspect to Africa and kind of change people's thinking around all of that. Yeah, it should have just, well, and I think it has in a way opened the door for a lot of other film and TV representations. But it's interesting when you reflect back to literature, from the discussion we heard with Wole and Ainehi earlier, the sort of the idea that speculative fiction and African futurism goes back quite a long way into the past is also quite interesting. And you obviously, you know, have got influences and ideas and sort of inspirations that have prompted the kind of writing that you've produced. Can you tell us a bit about those sources of inspiration for COSMOGRAMMA, for example, Courttia?
Well, you know, for COSMOGRAMMA, I was just, you know, and I do this with everything I write, whether it's speculative fiction or not. You know, I'm just drawing from, you know, cultural moments, you know, lives, experiences that occur in the diaspora. You know, everything is about that. You know, it's all about, you know, whatever's going on, whatever I encounter, whatever I already know, you know, whatever I feel, whatever my friends feel that's going on in the diaspora. And that's about it, really. I mean, that's all I can really say is that you know, you know, whether it's myths and legends and urban stories and gossip from down the road, you know, I mean, all of this is encompasses the Black experience, the African diaspora experience, and that's what I draw from. And to me, I'm not particularly fussed whether I'm telling speculative fiction stories or whether I'm telling crime stories or whether I'm telling social realism stories, or I'm just telling stories, and it's always going to be infused with that element because that element is my perspective. That's where I come from. You know, I mean, that's me. Yeah. That's what makes me who I am. So, and everybody around me. So, yeah. That's
I think that's particularly true in the sense that it's like I saw the conversation with Sean Jacobs the other day, and I think it is a very London book. There are recognizable kind of street corners, and I love the story where the people meet up because of a signal, and then they kind of control pedestrians and get them to do what they want. Was really telling, because although the ability to do that, the psychic kind of power they had was, you know, futuristic or sort of science fiction. You know, the locale and the idea of, you know, bashing someone's head against an Amazon pickup locker, it's just it's all illustrative of places I know, and things I've seen. Obviously, it goes pretty dark side after that as well, but I won't give that away.
Yeah,
you do you do reference Sun Ra in your opening to the book, so I was thinking partly about music, but also about the sort of 70s, 60s and 70s of African American music, and someone like Sun Ra, who had this kind of mythic but also kind of Egyptian influence to his thinking, and his kind of cosmology seemed to reach beyond Earth. And I suppose some of the reasons for that is sort of when you're dealing with disenfranchisement, it's very tempting to kind of speculate and create a world in which you can change all the conditions in which people live, and create a universe, you know, which fits more, perhaps in a slightly more fantastical way, I suppose, with Sun Ra, but fits a world, you know, where things are quite different and the power relations change. Did that come into your thinking?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was about particularly like yoking the things that I think are interesting about speculative fiction to the worldview and experiences that I have. So and that, I think Sun Ra was particularly good at that. You know, he was saying, okay, so we've got this past that maybe some people are unsure about or don't know about or whatever. But I'm going to yoke that to my reality. I'm going to yoke that to my personality, who I am as Herman, and then I'm going to use the tools that I have at my disposal, you know, which was jazz and stuff, and I'm going to try and recreate that here in this place, you know. And that's what I'm doing with a lot of those stories. That's why I set the stories in Stratford, or I set the stories in Shepherd's Bush, you know. Like with the Scarecrow, I was like, you know, wouldn't it be brilliant if I had a zombie story set in Shepherd's Bush? That's never happened before. In the same way that Neil was doing that in District 9, you know, it's like what we know this trope already, but what would happen if I set this in South Africa rather than it always being in America, which we always see time and again?
Exactly.
And I think that's for me my contribution to this conversation that Siphiwe is taking part in, and everybody else that's on this call, these panels are involved in, and everybody else that's involved in this genre is involved in as well. But my contribution to that is just to kind of to give my distinctly Black British, African British perspective, you know, to tell the story from where I'm standing from. And it's kind of like to communicate that to you, Siphiwe, so you can communicate back to me what's going on in Zimbabwe, and we're having this big conversation. That's the only reason for me to do it.
It's just it's making me think of Attack the Block as well. That kind of, you know, having an alien invasion in the Peckham estate is like, it does do something to your kind of sense of excitement for a film or for a book, certainly. And and there's also
the possibility for the expansion of where these things can take place and who they can happen to, and you know, just like, and whose stories are relevant, you know.
Yeah. And I also think about, you know, who should be the hero, who always the who's going to save the day kind of narrative. It's never projected in the, I don't think, or not enough anyway, on our screens and in the books we read. I was going to say, just additionally, I don't need you to necessarily respond, but the John Wyndham reference is also quite clear in the story, The Seed. And I was really feeling the Triffids in that story, and also a link to sort of like the revenge of the natural world on humankind. So that was also really fascinating to me. I want to ask Siphiwe just to go back to there's the Wakanda question, but also this idea that you're kind of telling Zimbabwean story, or a very Bulawayo story, and linking it to this technological development of a father, or Gumide, who wants to fly and wants to build a plane, and this ancestral link with his grandfather and his father, who also wanted to explore these sorts of areas which weren't always possible for people from his background. And I made immediately the connection with, I don't know if you've read Namwali Serpel's The Old Drift.
Not yet.
It's probably good that you haven't, because you still have that joy to come. She includes the Afronauts in Zambia in that, and there was a space program that ran in Lusaka that was run by a man who was widely portrayed in sort of Western media as completely crazy, but who turned out to actually, possibly on two different levels, have, you know, a certain amount of technological expertise, but on the other hand, using it as a camouflage for revolutionary activity. So there was this double, and the idea that it seemed impossible to grasp from a Western journalist point of view that someone could be that, they could be up to that much subterfuge. You know, their take was just, this guy's nuts. He's rolling people in barrels to prepare them for zero gravity. It's never going to work. You know, and I love the idea of the airplane, and it's never clear in your book whether or not they do fly. And I like the mythic, the sort of uncertainty. And this is where African speculative fiction kind of mixes a bit with magical realism. And I wonder if you could talk about the inspiration for that idea, the theory of flight.
So, I mean, for me, to be honest, I wasn't aware that I would ever be part of such a panel of discussion, because I wasn't aware that that's what I was writing, right? I was just writing stories, like Courttia said, you know, the stories around you, what people are talking about. So when I was a child, these were the stories around me. And The Theory of Flight is very much a novel that tries to capture that. So there was a story in the paper of a man who was trying to build a plane. And I think that caught my attention as a child. And I think a lot of people made fun of him. And at the time, I didn't understand why. And part of what I'm trying to do in the novel is sort of like tease out that why would people think it's impossible for a person who comes from a particular part of the world to be able to do this. And so I just grew up with, you know, that story and wanting to examine it. And I think a lot of the other stories in the novel really are from the 80s and 70s, things that I read about, things that I heard about, things that were around me that I was just trying to capture. So I wasn't aware that I was being speculative or writing magical realism, maybe the magical realism a little bit more. But for me, that's just how stories were told. And that's how stories have always been told. You know, there's always a magical element. There's always, you know, like Wole said in the beginning, there's always this technological aspect that is part of what we're doing, you know. And so I just never really thought I was doing anything different or new. I just felt that that's how we tell stories, you know, where I come from. They have all these elements, you know, and so I just really wanted to capture that.
Yeah, I mean, my familiarity with Zimbabwean fiction and storytelling as well as South African is, you know, there's a lot of hyenas flying on broomsticks over people's houses in the night, and there's a lot of tokoloshis that steal people's underwear, and, you know, sometimes make the headlines on the front page of the national newspaper, which, you know, and everyone's like, well, I didn't really see him, but he was definitely there, and, you know, we found the knickers in his house, so he must be the one with the tokoloshi, and, you know, it's because he's magical, he's disappeared, you know. So even in modern stories, there's still those magical elements that come from old-fashioned sort of storytelling, and there are still lots of unexplained phenomena which happen. You know, we all know somebody who's seen a ghost, or who's, you know, convinced they've seen a spaceship. So yeah, I love how that kind of ties into storytelling generally, and I think the way you begin the book, where you go through the kind of ancestry, sort of reflects that, the genealogy of stories that come from way back. And I thought, yeah, that it was partly that idea of flying, and the way you sort of begin at the end and return to the idea of your central character, Jeannie, flying away. And again, nobody witnesses it, but she's held on to the belief that her parents flew away when the Gukurahundi happened, and that's kind of enabled her to survive. And I think that's something that's really crucial to storytelling, is how it kind of enables you to accept sometimes the unacceptable. You create a narrative which helps you to explain the impossible. Can you tell me a bit more about sort of growing up in Bulawayo and how that, you know, affected your need to write? Why did you want to write these stories?
So I was very fortunate that I had a grandmother who was just a very extremely gifted storyteller. So I grew up listening to stories, and then she was also a teacher, so she actually gave me a lot of books to read. And I think I just took to the idea of, the fictional world. I'm an only child, so I had a lot of time on my hands. I mean, I used to play with other kids, but I also had a lot of time just to be by myself in my head. And then I always was making up stories. And then I also took to drawing on my grandmother's wall, and that had to stop. And then they bought me like a scrapbook and everything. So I was always wanting to tell stories, and I always kind of knew that I would be a writer. I didn't know how difficult it would be to be a writer at the time, but I just knew that that's something that I wanted to do. So I just, I was very fortunate to have grown up around a place and around a person who just loved telling stories. And Bulawayo at the time was shrouded in silence, because when I was growing up, that's when Gugurundi was happening. So there was a story that was happening that no one was really allowed to talk about. And it was very obvious that something was going on. We saw things going on, but you could not really talk about it, or you could not really read about it. So I think a lot of people my generation decided it's time for us to write, we're going to write about that story. So it's not, a lot of writers from the region have written about that particular incident because I think of the silence around it mostly, and just like trying to tease out what that was about and what was really going on. So yeah, I think it was a lot of those factors coming together to make me write about the place and the time that I grew up in.
Yeah. And it's like with Courttia's is sort of recognizably London, or definitely the UK. Your book, although it's an unnamed country, is recognizably Zimbabwean. And we have the what does he call himself? The man himself, and the organization who, I'm reading as Robert Mugabe and ZANU PF. But there's a satire there, which is well trodden in some Zimbabwean fiction, but the kind of exploration of Gukuruhundi, which I just want to go back to briefly, is kind of really important for me in terms of you place yourself with other writers. So you would be talking about Navoyo Rosa Schumer, who's written The House of Stone, which deals with the genocide in the late 80s, and also Yvonne Vera, who wrote in The Stone Virgins about the happenings in Matabeleland. And I think it's been really clear with the transition now to the new president that things haven't changed, and those histories are still relevant, and that the fear in Zimbabwe is always that will come back, and that will happen again. I think it's in some ways very brave to center that. In some ways it becomes the causal moment of, for example, Jeannie's life that changes. And one of the things that's never really addressed when people write and talk about Gukuruhundi is the link with HIV infection. And I thought it was extremely pertinent and important that you made that link, and that rooting the HIV crisis in the 80s and in the sexual violence that happened then, to me was a real stunner. I've worked on HIV in fiction for a long time, and it's very rarely centered in that way. What led you to include that alongside the Gukuruhundi?
I mean, again, I think it's a lot of things that we don't talk about. So for me, it was always very, Zimbabwe has a history of violence, and, and a history of displacement. And, so there's a way in which bodies move. And I was thinking of, well, if in the 80s we had this atrocity, and then in the 80s we had this other atrocity, surely they must be linked on some level, right? So it's not to say, obviously, that Gukuruhundi is the reason why HIV/AIDS happened the way it did in Zimbabwe, but it's to say that there must be a way in which that violence led to this particular, that violence also affected the particular thing, right? And because a lot of people were displaced at the time, so there's a lot of movement, but if there's a lot of, just a general silencing of the very idea of sexual violence. I think we're very used to talking about, military violence just being sort of like people shooting people and killing people, but there's also this other aspect of it that we never really talk about, and that women have never really been also able to talk about because there's no space for it. So you can talk about, oh, they cut my foot, but oh, you can't really talk about, you know, and then they violated me because there's no space for that, you know. So I really just wanted to sort of like unsilence that and sort of like show this possible connection. And to be honest, I think for the longest time, I didn't know that's what had happened to Jeannie myself. And on some level, I think I leave it up to the reader to decide what really happened, you know, which of those two things that happened in her life led to what happened in the end. I wanted to be an open question, but at the same time, when I was writing the novel, because I wrote it over 10 years, I wasn't always aware that's where it was going. And then when that happened, I mean, you know, it just really brought home to a lot of things for me, the writer, that, you know, it was an extremely violent time, and I shouldn't just assume because she was a child, she was just a spectator, right? She was also probably a more involved victim in all of that. And I had to allow, because sometimes you're trying to protect, you know, your characters, and, you know, I had to sort of like allow for that to happen. And I think I didn't want that to happen to her for the longest time. So yeah, it's a lot of, you know, unspeakable things that I felt needed to finally be said. Yeah.
But I also think what's remarkable about Jeannie is that she is such an optimistic, kind of joyful character. She's actually the bond maker, or the person who links all of the people in the story, and the way she transforms other people's lives as well as her own, in a sense, is quite wonderful. So I do think I can understand why you wanted to protect her, and it did leave me guessing for a long time. I think, Courttia, as well, you have this, I mean, so if you think of Siphiwe's book as a kind of dystopia that's transformed in a way into something quite beautiful by the end, I think, Courttia, you're taking what can be described as dystopian London and pushing it to the extreme in the different stories. So I'm particularly thinking about moments in which the children are being chased by what appear to be death squads linked to immigration or linked to some sort of outsider status. And I know there's an element of realism to that when you think of Windrush, and you think of, you know, the way in which the Home Office kind of treats people in this country at the moment, that made it very recognizable, but of course pushed it to an extreme. Do you think it's necessary to write that kind of fiction to sort of draw attention to those issues, or is it a different tactic altogether?
Yeah, I think it's very necessary. Like I said, you know, I'm trying to encapsulate our experience, and I'm trying to do that in an uncensored way. So whether it's talking about the things that we do that might be deemed as negative as human beings, or the things that people outside of us do that might be deemed as negative, I think it's all fair game, and I will talk about that stuff. The interesting thing with that story, I think, is that I actually wrote it. I can't remember when it was that a far-right political party whose name has slipped my mind, mainly probably because I don't want to remember who they are.
Yeah, let's not name them. Don't give them any publicity.
Exactly. I'm thinking, it's good, I can't really remember them, but they nearly got into power. So I think I wrote that story maybe about, it must have been a good 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and they nearly got into power, and they didn't get into power. And I wrote that story as a kind of like, aha, wouldn't it be like not funny, but like this would be the result if they had got into power. So this is well before Brexit.
Yeah.
This is there, but it didn't happen. And I remember doing the first time I did it, and here's the story that I wrote, just that would show the alternative if this would have happened, and everybody in the audience laughed. So then about 5, 6 years later, I read the story again, and I said, before I'd written it because of this eventuality, but now I'm reading it, things are very different. Kind of like it has kind of happened. And you know, I didn't say that, but I said, you know, I did it then because it was a bit of a laugh. Not a laugh in a story's funny, but in a laugh, hey, you know, this is what you guys tried to do. But this time nobody laughed. And when I read it, the atmosphere in the audience was really different, and people were just like, God, because it had kind of happened. I think it must have been around Brexit when I read it that time, you know.
I was going to say there are massive Brexit influences. I think
Yeah.
Farage on the TV turns up at some point in that other story with the.
That's in the other story. I mean,
the psychic
yeah,
powers.
that was linked.
You know, that kind of laughing face, man with a pint of beard. I'm just a harmless chap, but actually,
that's right. That's the guy I wasn't going to name.
Sorry, I've done it.
But in Link, I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to talk about this. In Control, the other story with the kids who've been chased by the immigration control, that was trying to say, oh, what if, basically. But then it turned out to be true. And like I said, with talking about Red, White, and Blue and Snorlax, you know, you write these things, and people are saying, oh, you know, this is really pertinent. You've written it for the times and stuff. And the fact is that we don't write these things for the times. The times are circular. And these things keep coming round again and making it pertinent because nothing really changes. And that's a really scary thing, that idea that the things we're writing politically don't go away. They just, that you could write them 10 years before and they're still going to be relevant 10 years later, and maybe even longer than that.
Absolutely. Isn't that what George Orwell's definition of fascism is? Something to do with it's just the same boot stamping on your head. Like, you know, there's a universalism to the way that creeps up on us that, you know, you can't deny the reality of at some point. And I mean, we have been living in a world which has become fairly kind of confusing. And, you know, with Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, I sometimes wonder if I'm living in a kind of fantasy world where, you know, there's another reality which is really happening. And this is just the sort of third or fourth alternative universe that I wish would, you know, wake me up from this sort of dream. I also thought that that in the time travel one, that the story where you go quite far into the future and the spaceship, I think it's the Sankofa principle. And I love that link with Sankofa. I thought that was really great to bring that symbol back in. What was interesting about that is that you actually use the potential travel into the future to go back into the past to the slavery moment. And I thought that was a really powerful story about what the dilemma would be. Because they always tell you in time travel, never ever mess with the past. You know, everyone knows, you know, from Back to the Future, you don't kill your own parents inadvertently because you won't be born, etc. But that moment where they have to choose, could they have prevented slavery? You just think, oh, wait a minute. You know.
Well, like so many other things, these questions don't necessarily apply, or they apply differently if you're black. You know, and I think this a lot sometimes when I'm seeing conversations that are going on Twitter or whatever. I say, yeah, but if you're black, that's a completely different slant, you know. And I just wanted to look at that question of, like, you know, would you change slavery, even if that would mean you might not be born, just to stop these things happening. I wanted to give that, like, you know, a serious thought. And it kind of tied up with the symbolism of Sankofa. And I wanted to tell a really, really far-flung into the distance futuristic story as well, where space travel is totally happening and is a reality, and kind of break it down like more hard sci-fi than some of the other speculative fiction stories I was telling. So I was really pleased with that. I really felt that worked very well for myself anyway.
But also you project a fairly hopeful future in a sense, because the people chosen for the project have such mixed heritage. The world has gone and become so much more advanced, but it's not necessarily, I mean, it's not at all negative that they have African ancestry or Chinese ancestry. You know, that felt a bit more Star Trek-y, where you sort of had this utopia, and then you think, well, maybe, but messing with that is a problem, like, potentially. I mean, but it does make you think about where we're going. Is that possible? And all of that.
Well, their commonality came way before slavery, and I think that was the point I was trying to make. Their commonality came from the commonality that stems from, you know, Africans being the first people on this planet, you know, and that's what the linkages were between them. They recognized that, and I felt that even that would be a really progressive far leap forwards from where we are now, which is a bit of a shame, really. But you know, I was hopeful, and they'd corrected a lot of the wrongs at that point in the story. So even though there's this strange stuff going on in the past, the future was a little bit more hopeful than, say, in some of the other stories, you know, in the book.
Yeah, because the direction of a lot of the other stories is fairly dark. And again, I'm going to go back to the seed. I think the way that you link the natural world to the horror of So I could just tell you briefly that there's a plant that seems to grow into the form of the human whose garden it lives in.
Or the person who touched the seed, basically.
Or who's touched the seed. But so this sort of feeling of that they're going to take over, or they're going to get closer to the house and they're going to do something, like honestly terrifying. I was very much thinking you should be writing Doctor Who episodes.
I mentioned John Wyndham. You mentioned John Wyndham, sorry.
Yeah.
And I mean, you was right on the money. You know, I wanted to do a John Wyndham story. I loved John Wyndham as a kid. I loved Tales of the Unexpected. You know, and I really wanted to do a really scary, sit around the fireplace kind of horror story, but again, say it in London. The protagonist is Nigerian, British. You know what I mean? I just wanted to do that kind of thing. So yeah, it's meant to be super scary. That and Scarecrow, I went to kind of delve a little bit into horror with those stories.
Yeah, no, I think you do that really, really well. On a lighter note though, Siphiwe, you are drawing from horror in some ways, but you're also creating characters, as I said, that are quite hopeful and quite positive, but also very unusual in African fiction. The Gomide's wife, the mother of Jeannie, has got this obsession with country and western music, which I loved, and the Carpenters keep coming up, certain songs, and of course Bob Marley, who did perform in Zimbabwe at independence. So there's all this music in the background, which might not be links to Sunrise as such, but it creates a sort of comic element. And I kept wondering about her blonde wig and what, like, how that became normalized, you know, like on a farm somewhere, you know, in the fairly rural hinterlands. Can you tell me a bit more about the people you know who wear Dolly Parton wigs and sing country voice?
So I grew up listening to a lot of country and western, and there was a saying in Zimbabwe when I was growing up that, you know, every person has a Dolly Parton album and a Don Williams album in their home. That's what makes a home a home. And so I just grew up a lot with this music, and I don't think the way we see ourselves in that moment is the way the rest of the world would see us looking in. I think the rest of the world would be like, why are these people listening to country music? But we're listening to stories, right? We're listening to people sing about heartache, and you know, that's what we're listening to in that moment. So I know she was huge. I know she, you know, for the longest time we thought she was going to come and do a concert, and she never did. I think we're still waiting in some ways for her to come and do a concert. We really, I mean, you know, I don't know if it's still true now that, you know, people love her as much, but when I was growing up, for sure. And I still listen to Dolly Parton. I still listen to Don Williams because it's part of my memories of my childhood. I don't remember anyone wearing a blonde wig. I think that was just, you know, my imagination going wild. But it was fascinating to me to think of this person who is so invested, right, in becoming this thing, that she actually, you know, takes on this whole persona. And very believable too, because I think that's what dreams are made of. And the book is a lot about people's dreams and, you know, what they want to be possible in their lives and what stops those things from being possible. But yeah, so I just, you know, the Carpenters too. I mean, you know, that's just the music I grew up with. And I think there's a way in which, you know, like all that music is part of, it doesn't seem to create a disharmony or a cacophony or whatever. It's just music around you. You know, people are not necessarily saying, oh, you know, that's reggae, oh, that's country music. At least that's not how it was when I was growing up. It was just like, it's music, you know, we just consume music. And I think that, you know, and I think what we were looking, like, I'll say it again, what we were looking for in the music and in the songs were the stories. And if it told a good story, we listened to that song, you know. So that was what I was really trying to capture, just like being able to just love music for being able to tell stories. Yeah.
And I've got a comment there from Ainehi saying that she also grew up in Nigeria listening to Don Williams and Dolly Parton and The Coats of Many Colors. Like, that used to make me cry, that song. I used to get really emotional.
I was saying the other day, I was saying the other day that it's the same in the Caribbean as well. We
Really?
live in a country in Western as well, particularly my mum and my grandparents, and also my uncle loves loves Westerns. So he would sit on a Sunday afternoon and just watch the run. He's from Barbados. He just watch all the Westerns, and he would love them and be able to name them the stars and everything. He's really into that.
That's really quite strange. I've got another comment from Tendai saying that Don Williams did come to Zimbabwe in the 90s,
Wow.
which is amazing. I had a friend in South Africa who lived in Katlehong near Johannesburg, and she had a massive crush on Ronan Keating, and I never understood, like, how has this happened to you? You know, I just felt really bad about it, and I was like, it wasn't my fault, but I just, I wanted to take responsibility. But you can't. There's no accounting for taste.
In the sound systems, in the old blues dances and stuff, there would be usually a moment when I was growing up when they would always play "Guilty," Barbra Streisand and Barry Gibb, and like, just go nuts. You know what I mean? And "Guilty" with the big shoes, like, so it's just like there's something in it. That's the storytelling, the soulfulness. You know what I mean? The feeling, the emotion that just grabs people, no matter what the genre is.
Yeah. Well, I do love that. And again, coming back to the small acts, the Lovers Rock, I think, especially as a Londoner, I think that the dance floor is where everything melts here. Mm-hmm. And you can play, if it's a good tune, everyone will dance. And there's kind of a nice feeling when you kind of, get that vibe from everyone's feeling good, and it doesn't really matter what it is.
Don't care. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So I'm getting close to having to wrap up, I think. We've got a couple more minutes. I don't know if there are any questions coming up on our comments. Did you have any questions for each other? I'd be curious. You've both been reading each other's work. Did you want to ask each other a question?
I mean, I didn't have so much questions as observations. As that kind of that horrible thing that sometimes people say at conferences and stuff. You're like, oh god, here we go. But I mean, and I think I was talking about it the other day. For me, like, I do have a question. Yes, so that process of structuring your novel, because it's so intricately woven, and the passing the baton kind of style that you have from character to character. How did you come up with that? Did you plot it at length before you wrote it? Did you just put it down and then work it out? What was your process for structuring the novel?
So again, I wrote the novel over 10 years. So I think for a long time it was it was trying to find a structure. The novel was, and the plotting, came, I think, very end, the plotting that you read when you read the novel now, because there were a lot of flashbacks, and they were kind of like getting in the way of the forward movement of the story. And it was like, how do you then tell it so that it's got all this, history, but is able to be a forward moving story at the same time? So I removed those flashbacks and then made them, sort of like the genealogy and history sections, of the novel. And that seemed to, it seemed to flow a lot better that way. But yeah, so I think I saw the characters clearly. The story came along eventually, but I think the plotting was the thing that I really had to think about most, because it was a lot to handle. And I think when I first started, I wasn't aware that it was a lot to handle, because again, it was my first novel. So I just thought, this is what novels do.
But did you write outline first? Did you write outline first, or did you just write?
I think
it's
obvious from there.
No, not at all. No, it actually isn't. I was thinking you had reams of papers and different timelines and everything on your walls and all that. Mad writer stuff.
No. For the second one, yes, but for the first one, no. I think I was just, happy to be writing most of the time. I was writing because I was writing my PhD at the time. So it's always nice to just have something creative to write. Yeah, so that's how that came about. I mean, I think for my question for you is, I really liked a lot of the stories, and I really liked the Sankofa thing, and that stays with me, the symbol. And I really like how you, I suppose this is not a question, this is just saying how much I really liked that. But like, you know, like Lizzy was saying, like, I really like the way of putting those two historical moments, you know, together, sort of like the future and the past, and then asking these really deep questions about, you know, what would that look like? But I was also wondering, and I don't know if, if this was not careful reading on my part, like, what did happen? What did happen?
What
happened?
In terms of yeah. My friend said to me, he's like, you have to read it again to work out what happened
like,
to them. Yeah. So basically, the WISP drive is the drive that utilizes like the power of like black holes to be able to send you distances into the future. But because of epigenesis, they're saying part of what the WISP does is tap into your DNA, basically, and tap into what you might think in your soul, like you care about, or something that bothers you. So inherited trauma, the idea of inherited trauma basically comes into play. And it wasn't just the African characters who had the inherited trauma, it was the Chinese character and the European character, because they're all basically Africans. You know what I mean? They all stem from the same genealogy. You know what I mean? They all have that DNA and they all have that trauma. So basically, when all four of them got together and they were like-minded, that meant they were sent to the place in their heart that they really wanted to go, rather than being sent to Saturn, basically. So that's what the guy, and then he kind of postulates that he's like, you know, everyone laughed at me, you know, everyone thinks that's complete rubbish, how could that be possible? And so but that's what I believe, basically. So it's not I never say in the story that's definitely what happened, but that's what the main character believes in it and happened, and he wrote a book about it, and everyone just laughed him out of town and just said that's completely ridiculous and unscientific or whatever. But he's like, I feel that and believe that, which I think is something that happens to us all the time, right? I was saying also that back in the day, Rastas used to say that Africans were the first people on Earth, and everyone's saying, they're just smoking too much wacky backy, what do they know, or whatever. And now DNA has scientifically proven that Rastas were flipping right. You know, they were right, and Fela Kuti was right, and was right. You know, so interesting. A lot of these things that you're crazy and whatever get proven scientifically later on down the line in the West.
Yeah, and that we do carry knowledge, you know, for centuries, which I think is also fascinating. I'm trying not to end this on a Ghostbusters note, but I do think of the Whippy man at the end. That happens. You're not supposed to think of him. You're supposed to, and that's what leads to their fate. So I'm trying not to make that connection of the.
I think that subconsciously stuck in my mind because that was always something that I really liked about Ghostbusters.
Tough marshmallow man, and then
they couldn't think
there
of it. Yeah.
I should make the link with Octavia Butler and Kindred, which for a time traveling book that specifically goes back to that moment of slavery and ancestry. You know, is I think something that I would think of if I was wearing my special doctor hat. Thank you so much.
Yes, that's what we do.
But Ghostbusters is there too. You know, we can't help it. We are influenced by everything. We're a multifarious bunch of folk. I've really enjoyed talking to you both. I hope everyone else has enjoyed listening. Indeed, I hope there are people listening, because that's one of the things about teaching in a virtual environment is you never know who's actually there. But it's been great talking to you both. I really highly recommend everyone reads both of your books.
Lots of people watching, Lizzy.
Oh, good. That's fantastic. I'm going to go and make the tea, but I'll be tuning in later on to see what everyone else is saying, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hello?
Hi. So we're
Hello, Efua. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
It's nice to finally meet you.
Yes.
Hold on, let me increase my volume here so I can hear you. There we go. Yeah, well, how are you doing?
I'm good. I've been absolutely enjoying myself. I was almost disappointed that I need to talk about myself and my book now, because it's so much more interesting listening to others talking. But yes,
Well, trust me, your book is fantastic, and I'm sure everyone is looking forward to, to having you talk about it. Hello, everybody. I'm Ainehi, as some of you already know, and I just wanted to say thank you to Bhakti for holding this this event and for making space for us to think about new African writing. I have with me here today Efua Traoré. And she is sort of a newish voice in the African literary space. I was looking at your bio today, and you won the Commonwealth Short Story Prize in 2018.
Yes.
Oh wow, that's wonderful. And she is a Nigerian German author. You say it said here that you grew up in a small Nigerian town. Which town is that?
Ekmoma, that's where I come from.
Seriously?
And I have a question for you. Are you from there? Because your name is
Girl, I'm Esan now. That's the way you are saying.
I'm your sister, Onegbe.
Oh, free. Oh my God, this is so special. I mean, there aren't a lot of Edo people, to be honest, in like the African literary space. So it's always nice to meet someone. My sister went to university in Ekpoma.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my dad was a lecturer there for a long time. So that's when I grew up there.
I see. Oh, well, that's wonderful. Well, you have this new book that is out, titled Children of the Quicksand. And we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about it. Yes. So why don't you, to kind of get us started, tell us just quickly what the book is about. And then I know that you were open to reading a short portion for us. All right, cool. And then we can launch into talking about the book proper.
Okay. Yeah, so Children of the Quicksands is about city girl Simi, a 13-year-old girl who gets sent to stay with her grandmother, whom she's never met, in a distant, remote village somewhere in the forests of Nigeria, where there's no electricity, no phone network, she's obviously not too happy about going, and her grandmom turns out to be, kind of more than just the healer and dispenser of advice for the villagers. And she's also very, very tight-lipped about the past, just like her mom has always been. But Simi knows that something awful must have happened because, to make them not speak to each other for so many years. And she's very intent on finding out this family secret. And she soon finds herself steeped in myths and legends and superstitions. And but her adventure actually really starts when she strays into the forest and to a forbidden lake and finds herself sinking into quicksand.
Okay, wonderful.
And then I'll just read a short bit from, I think I'll do chapter 2, titled Journey to the Unknown. The journey to Ajao turned out to be terribly exhausting. The untarred road was deeply rutted by rain and erosion, so that the driver only made slow and difficult progress. The car screeched and moaned so much that Simi worried they might not arrive in one piece. To the left and right, the dense forest crowded into the road. Tall trees and bushes, higher and thicker than she had ever seen anywhere around Lagos, gave the road a pleasantly cool shade. But at the same time, the forest, towering high above them, felt threatening. "What are these trees?" she asked the old driver, who hadn't spoken a word since they left. "Trees." He turned his gaze from the road to look at her, and she immediately worried about him not seeing the next pothole. "What are those trees called, the tall ones?" she asked a little louder. He looked at her from underneath his wrinkled eyelids. Brown teeth stained with kola nut flashed as his mouth split into a crooked grin. "Iroko. This is Iroko tree, tree of spirits," he said in a cracked voice. She nodded quickly and breathed a sigh of relief. Oh, sorry. She nodded quickly and breathed a sigh of relief when he finally turned back to face the road. Tree of spirits. His words echoed in her mind like ghostly whispers, and she felt queasy as she stared at the long-limbed trees. Woman, where they take you? She be your grandmother, he said after a short while. That didn't sound like a question, but she felt she had to say something. So she replied, yes. Your grandmother, she be very good woman. People know I'm well. Well, not known by me, Simi thought, and looked out of the window listlessly. After an hour's drive, as Simi had feared, there was a loud crash, and the car got stuck in a pothole. The driver made a hissing sound and clicked his tongue loudly. You go help me, he grumbled over his shoulder. He got out of the car, bent down, and disappeared from view. Simi opened the door and climbed out gingerly. The old man knelt in front of the car on the rough ground, muttering. Kia, kia, he suddenly called. Quick! He pointed to the back of the car with a crooked index finger. Push! Simi stumbled quickly to the rear. A sudden rustling sound in the bushes beside her made her look around nervously. The huge Iroko trees on both sides of the road trembled in the breeze and seemed to arc over her like agitated giants. Goosebumps formed on her skin as she remembered the driver's words. Push! The driver called again. Simi's head jerked up. The rustling from the bushes came again, and she tried to put away all thoughts of snakes and other animals that might be lurking in the forest. She began to push the car with all the energy she could muster. The car hardly budged. What if they did not get the car out, she thought, as she looked around fearfully. In the last half hour, they had not driven past a single village or town, or seen a single person.
Thank you very much. It's a gorgeous story, and it's a young adult fiction. I read the book with my 6-year-old daughter, who we started out reading it together, and then she just couldn't wait anymore. And one day she came and said, Mommy, I finished it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I had to go back and read it by myself. But it centers this girl who is very personable, very lovable. Like, you root for her the moment you meet Simi. I wanted to maybe start with the question of the inspiration for this story. Where did it come from?
Well, the story itself came from I would say definitely from my childhood, because where Ekpoma, we lived at the edge of town in the staff quarters. So beyond our house, there was nothing but bushes, farmland, forests. And so we were actually very adventurous. I had a very adventurous childhood. We were always outside scaling fences. Often I had my little sister perched on my back, and then we would go searching for mango trees. And we found this red valley. We used to slide down, and this stretch of dry land we called desert. But our most mysterious discovery was this lake of red muddy water that was hidden behind dusty bushes. And when we approached it, we found out that the banks were slippery like quicksand. So that kind of stayed with me. And when I found myself writing this book, it sort of grew out of the setting, and I kind of knew it would center around a lake with quicksands.
That's fascinating. One of the questions that came up while I was reading this book with my daughter Evie was that she was intrigued that the soil was red, right? She was just like, what does that mean? I've never seen, well, yes, I've never seen red soil. And so I had to explain to her that, when you come from the Midwest part of Nigeria, where I'm from, right, and where you're also from as well, that the iron in the soil makes it red. So, yes. It seems to me that to build this fictional world, you're drawing from things that were familiar to you, but you're sort of amplifying them in ways that become really fantastical. I was intrigued by the shift that you made to set the story in Yoruba land.
what was the reason for that? Because from what you're saying, you're from Ekboma, and sort of the foundational experience is in Ekboma, but then the story is a Yoruba story. Why did you make that shift?
Well, actually, I'm quarter, exactly. I'm quarter Yoruba, quarter Ishan, and half German. Yeah. So, so my grandmother was Yoruba, so that's also part of my heritage, and we also moved to Lagos later on. So generally, the Yoruba mythology has always fascinated me. I mean, they've always been fantastic storytellers, and they have so many lovely myths about their deities, the Orisha, and I was always fascinated by anything that has to do with mythology, myths, and the old folklore stories we used to get told, or we had this show in those days, Tales by Moonlight, that would also show these kind of, tell these stories. So that was actually what always fascinated me, and what inspired me while writing. It actually, it just came naturally. I just found myself weaving in strands of mythology into the story. And yeah, I mean, the myths and the supernatural are, like it was already said previously, in Zimbabwe. It's the same thing in Nigeria. All these things are kind of part of everyday life in Nigeria. So it's, since I had created a setting also that was quite rural, and which was also, it's also closer to nature and to the supernatural kind of things, it was actually very easy and came naturally to just, yeah, feed in all these myths and supernatural things. Yeah,
I
the
see.
magic.
I have to say that one thing that struck me about the story is the way you represent rural life, right? Through this kind of respectful lens, in the sense that I left that story wanting to live in Ajao as opposed to Lagos, right? And that's something that tricks you at the beginning, because my Joshua was just like, what? No internet, no phone. Oh yeah, I completely understand why Simi is so frustrated. But then as we get into the story, it's clear that you could see her falling in love with this world, you know? So how did you kind of manage that calibration where you are able to invite the reader to fall in love with this world that is outside of the city, but that has its own beauty and its own values that the reader sort of discovers as she goes along?
I guess it's really, first of all, it's something that has always been very important for me. I guess it's because I left Ekboma then, the little town I was in, and moved to Lagos. So first of all, I had that impression of leaving this quiet area and then arriving in Lagos, and everything is different, and it's all about, what do I know, what series and what's going on, and fashion, and all these were things that were very new to me. So that was the first moment where it was very clear to me that, oh, something's different, and this is a totally different kind of life. And on the other hand, one thing that was also quite important for me was the depiction of Nigeria, Africa as a whole, out here in the rest of the world, has always bothered me. It's always very, very negative. So on the news, you're always seeing starving kids and war. When there's something nice and lovely to say about Africa or Nigeria, it doesn't come on the news. So I remember, I mean, I wrote the book for my kids, and at the point, I remember one of the triggers was also my 6-year-old coming home from school and telling me she learned something about Africa today. And I was like, oh, wow, what did you learn? And she said, yes, the children are hungry and they need food. And I was so disappointed, like, why is that the first and only thing they have to say about Africa? So first of all, I told her, next time if they discuss Africa, make sure you tell them your experiences from your holidays. What did you see there? What food did you eat? What fun did you have? What lovely people were there? And secondly, that kind of made me so determined to write this novel, which I had already been thinking of writing, because I wanted to show my children, the Nigeria I grew up in, that I love, and where I had this lovely, amazing, adventurous, fun childhood. And I definitely wanted to show also that a rural life or a simple life can be beautiful and can be full of adventure and courage, fun, and all these things. So I think that's why it was actually quite important for me to show that. To on one hand, want to show generally Nigeria is not only about poverty or whatever it is people think. There's so much more. There's so many different cultures, languages. There's also rural areas. There's bustling urban areas. And the fact that it's rural and the people don't have that much doesn't mean they're not having a happy, fun life. So yeah, that's where that came from.
Right, that there is adventure, there is delight, there is, you know, there's fun in this universe. I mean, it's making me think about, you know, how you get children to experience a world in a way that is meaningful, right? So I'm thinking about Harry Potter, for instance, right? The way J.K. Rowling makes wizardry into this thing that you desire, you know? It's not as if she's hitting you on the head and saying, you know, believe in this thing. She just creates this universe and you buy into it and you want to be a part of it. I felt like your book was doing that for an African world, right? That a child reads that and they want to be Simi, they want to go into the forest, they want to meet Lio, they want to, you know, solve this big puzzle that is, you know, obsessing, that the villagers are obsessing with. So this idea of inviting children to desire a world by translating it into storytelling seems to me something that maybe fantasy probably does much better than maybe a realist narrative. Would you say that?
Definitely. And I think the newer the world, the more unique, the easier it is, I guess, to pull in your readers, because they don't have any other points of reference. They can be distracted by. They just follow you right in. And yeah, obviously there's not so much literature for younger children. So I guess this will be new to many people who read it, and maybe it just takes you along that way.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the fact that I found it helpful as an immigrant parent to read this book with my daughter, right? But I was also intrigued by the fact that that it's a book that is also going to translate very well in an African context, because I am reading the book as a Nigerian who has lived in Nigeria, and then my daughter is reading it as somebody who is a Nigerian American, right? And then I think that you do a good job of pulling these two crowds in, so that, you know, I don't see a Nigerian reader, for instance, thinking that, oh, this book is some kind of Western imagination of what African life might be. And in fact, the book is going to be published in Nigeria by Masobe Books, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember, go on, what did you say?
I just said early 2022.
Okay. And I remember in one of the emails that we shared about that, Otuke, the publisher at Masobe, used the term. He said, I'm really happy that Efua's book has come home, right? So I like that. What do you anticipate Nigerian readers would think of the book? Or what do you hope they find and hold on to in the book?
Well, I hope exactly that it talks to them, to their hearts directly, because because I just kind of drew from growing up there, and it was something that was important for me. I missed these kind of books when I was little. I mean, we had, obviously, in my time, like I mentioned, that TV show, Tales by Moonlight. We had that, and then we had maybe a handful of books that were written by Nigerian authors. But that was it. So we had this beautiful library, amazing library in Ekpoma that was full to the brim with books. But it was, yeah, adventures of children elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
And so this was missing in my life. And when my kids were old enough to read, I was searching for these kind of books, for books that would reflect them, their lives, their heritage. I hardly found anything. I mean, Germany is even, it's a bit more difficult still than the UK and the US. So that was what pushed me to this, like the feeling of growing up and not having it, and now not wanting my children to have the same experience. So that's why I wanted to write something really authentic and, yeah, just so kids like mine or like those in Nigeria would just see it and be like, yes, this is how
like that's me.
Yeah. When I go to my village to see my grandmom, this is how it is there, you know.
It feels like, you know, it's like somebody saying, it's just, I mean, the way you built the fictional world is so real. It's so beautiful, you know, just from the way she's sleeping in the living room at her grandmother's place, you know, to the joko that she sits down on, you know, to the pots that they have, the 3-legged pots, you know, Murayo's father's bicycle that he rides. I'm just like, this is my life, you know. It's just that Efua has managed to make it way more fun and adventurous. So I mean, maybe we should talk a little bit about the mythological elements in the work, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? What aspects of the Orisha mythology you wanted to kind of bring to the fore in the story?
Well, considering Children of the Quicksands obviously is centered around a lake, and so water, the element of water plays an important role. That's why I chose the goddess Oshun, who's the goddess of water and also of fertility. And so she loves children. And yeah, so women would go to her when they want to have children to pray. And she's actually one of the most loved goddesses, I would say, among the Yoruba. There's a huge festival that celebrates her in Osogbo once a year. I think two whole weeks of celebration. So yeah, I've always found her fascinating, and so I absolutely wanted to include her into the story. And then I also included her sister Oya, who I also find absolutely fascinating. She's the goddess of the winds, and she has this rather tempestuous character and can be quite fiery. And she's also the gatekeeper to the dead, which I find so intriguing. I just had to include her. And yeah, so those were the two I took from the mythology and, yeah, included into the story.
I mean, it strikes me that they are both women. And this is also a story that centers girls, I think, in a way that is awesome. You know, the main character is a girl. Her close friend is a girl. There's Iyanla, her grandmother. It's a very woman-centric universe. I mean, I like that. You know, is that something that you were conscious about, or it's an aspect of the story that sort of kind of came together by itself?
I don't really know if it was very conscious. I think, like I said, my grandmother was Yoruba. Maybe that kind of subconsciously played a role. I just know, I just kind of knew Simi would have something driving her. That was kind of also the way her voice came about and her agency. And that was the fact that growing up, she always saw her mother in pain. She was kind of broken, and she knew something happened in her past. And yeah, I think there's a very special bond also between moms and daughters and grandmothers. And I can imagine that if that bond should get broken, that would really break someone if they don't want to admit it. So that was what Simi kind of all those years noticed. And that's what, when she gets to Ajao, that's what kind of drives her to want to find out what went wrong so she can help heal her mom. So that's kind of gave her that drive. And yeah, I guess that's just how the whole mother-grandmother relationship just came into focus. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for contributing to that trend. I've been seeing it a lot. Namina Fona's The Gilded Ones, Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone, Nnedi Okorafor's work is like, I'm seeing a ton of female characters, you know, centered in these worlds about adventure. And I think it's a very welcome trend. You know, I don't think that we can get enough of that. Tendai has just asked a question. He says, Efua, how do you deal with the sensitivities of drawing myth from what are still living active religions, which is different to, say, authors playing with the Greek or Norse mythology, because these religions are essentially dead now?
I don't know if I would see much of a difference in the mythology being dead or still being practiced or living. I just see these as amazing stories to tell, and that have fascinated me for a very long time. And I have been actually very sad that because just since you mentioned the Greek mythology, these were thoughts I had, like the Greeks have their gods and everything, and we also have our gods and goddesses and orisha. So where are our films and our stories and all that? So and I remember when I first read what's the name, Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone, I was like, yes, you know. Our Yoruba deities are so interesting, and
yes.
They have every right to be in books and in stories, and yeah, I don't have any worries at all to include them. These are stories that were told right from time. There has just been a disconnect because of television and social media bombarding kids nowadays. So that's telling stories to the next generation has kind of stopped. And since there are no books at the same time that transmit all these stories, there's really a big gap, I feel. And I'm so happy that finally all these books, these African YA and middle grade books are coming out, and it's great that a lot of YA are coming out, but I still want more middle grade for younger kids. I feel kids are they're so vulnerable. It's such an important phase in their lives where they're trying to discover themselves and their space, their place in this world. And then there's such a huge lack of books. And I mean, I know this is a big topic in the UK and in the US and everywhere, but in Africa or in Nigeria, it's still a bit different, because we need African set stories so children can grow up seeing their village where they go to visit their grandmom or whatever it is, or Lagos where they live. So that's really missing, and I really hope there'll be more books, especially for younger kids. In the area of African speculative fiction. Yes.
Thank you very much for saying that, right? Because the work of creating speculative fiction or science fiction for adults is slightly different from creating it for children. And I think that it's easy to neglect the importance of getting children involved in this, move to reimagine the continent. And honestly, watching my daughter read this story and become so gripped by it just shows me how much it's key that our children read stories about their worlds, and stories that invite them to, desire to be who they are and to love themselves and where they are from. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your work. And for me, it is very personal. It is special. It's a really wonderful book. There is a link for everyone where you can just get a copy of the book directly. I encourage parents who are here, siblings who are here, get this book for your family members and your friends. It is amazing.
Thank you.
Efua, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Bhakti is coming to be headmistress. All right, Bhakti.
Bye.
All right, take care.
I was muted the whole time. Thank you so much. And what I was saying before was thank you, Ainehi, and thank you, Efua. That was a great conversation, and your questions were great too. All right. So, Tendai, years and years ago, we communicated about something for our magazine, and I'm so happy to finally have a chance to interact with you, talk with you. You've done so much in the past year since our early emails for Warscapes magazine and the piece that you were writing for us then. So
you.
welcome. Yeah.
That must have been around 2012 or 13. It's yeah, we're showing our age now.
I know. Luckily, we're not showing our age, Tendai. Okay, but you're not. But I'm gonna read a little bio of you and update people on what you've been doing, and then maybe you too can read a little bit, since it seems like we've now been doing that with all the writers. So. Here's my bio for Tendai L. Huchu, who is a multi-talented, multi-genre writer from Zimbabwe, though he's joining us today from Edinburgh in Scotland. He's the author of The Hairdresser of Harare, published in 2010, and The Maestro, The Magistrate, and The Mathematician, published in 2014. Tendai's first novel was set in Harare in Zimbabwe, but since then he's been writing fiction set in Edinburgh. As is the case with the Library of the Dead and the whole series. His work has been included in many anthologies. He's written for several different outlets, and I just wanted to start by welcoming you, and also a huge congratulations. I know the book just came out, and already there's hype about the second one in the series. I believe the series is called Edinburgh Nights. So I want to start by asking you to tell us what this book is about, just a little story for people who haven't bought it yet, and then maybe read a short passage.
Thank you, Bhakti. I've really enjoyed this evening and all the discussions that have gone on before, and kudos to you guys for arranging this. I know it's a pain in every possible orifice to arrange these things and bring people together in the same space to do these things. So kudos to you guys. But the book we're talking about, The Library of the Dead, how to distill about 90,000 words into a few short sentences. It's the story of Ropa, a young girl from a slum just outside of Edinburgh who talks to ghosts for a living. So if you think about the age we live in, we monetize everything, TikTok, dance videos, and all that, right? So she pretty much gets messages from ghosts, passes them on, for a living. It's a very low wage job or low wage occupation. But one of the ghosts tells her about missing kids in Edinburgh. And since no one else is, initially she's reluctant to get involved because it's not her work. But because no one else is interested, she's eventually forced to look into it. And this just sort of leads her into the darker side of magic in Edinburgh. And she discovers an occult library. She meets a new magical mentor, and she battles villainous villains like the Midnight Milkman. So I'm just going to read a short excerpt from the first chapter, where she goes to perform an exorcism for this couple called the McGregors that live in a neighborhood called Juniper Green, which is just outside, on the outskirts of of the city, and this will just give you a flavor of what she is like as a character and a personality. So you can imagine I'm a bearded 15-year-old Zimbabwean Scottish girl.
With green hair.
With green dreadlocks, definitely.
Yeah.
I've asked the McGregors to turn off the lights around the house, and the only illumination comes from a lamp in the corner of the room. The light creeps up the walls, painting a half moon on the ceiling, and everything else is in the shadow of the lampshade. The telly's off, and in the silence, we can hear each other breathe. The couple hold hands, sitting in the two-seaters nearest the window, so I'm on my own on the big sofa. Been here 3 hours already. It's not yet the witching hour, but I feel a slight chill in the air, the subtle drop of temperature that makes me reach for my coat until I remember myself. How much longer? Mr. McGregor asks in a whisper. I hold up my hand to stop him from speaking. He might as well be asking about the length of a piece of string. In any case, breaking the silence will only ruin things. Already asked them both to be good little church mice. The chill in the still air hits them. Condensation vapor comes out of their mouths. They move closer to one another, the mister throwing an arm around the missus. The little hairs on my arms rise and goose pimples prick up all over my skin. The picture of the historian Thomas Carlyle clacks against the wall. The noise is awful in the silence. I sit up, lean forward, and put my elbows on my knees, clasping my hands together. The lamplight flickers. The flowers on the mantelpiece rustle, shedding fresh petals onto the floor. A creaking noise comes from the wood beams in the ceiling. Something sickening wafts through the air. Less a scent, it's a feeling of the forbidden, of sin, decadence, the smashing of a taboo that leaves an open wound on the soul of the world. The tongs strike the copper bucket, ringing out like a Chinese gong. Mr. McGregor makes a fist and bites down on his knuckles. Something turns the doorknob. A squeak escapes Mrs. McGregor's throat. The door opens and shuts with a bang. It opens again and shuts, opens, shuts. The bucket, picture, a statuette falls to the floor. God help us, Mr. McGregor whirls and crosses himself left shoulder, then right. Curtains fluttering, the locked windows rattling, commotion and chaos, small objects flung through the air, an ethereal grey figure rushing hither and thither in the dimness, knocking furniture over. This must be an old spectre, for it to have the power to so touch the material world. I watch as it throws the door open again. Are you done? I say, looking at the abhorrent apparition. It looks back at me, all dark eyes with an eerie tunnel running through its face in place of a mouth. It screams, a horrible squeal like a slow-cut throat in a slaughterhouse. A wind rises in the room with its squeal, and it rushes towards me, mouth wide open, from floor to chin as though it would eat me. The pages of a magazine on the coffee table flip open as the spectre bears down and stops right in front of my face with a terrible howl. I said, "Are you done, sir?" I reach for my backpack and stand up. This is quite the racket you're making here. And that's where I'll leave it, a brief reading, but you can see that hideous ghosts do not faze Ropa at all.
Yes, not at all. And she's just a wonderful, exciting, sassy character. And I think one of the things that's interesting, just hearing you read it, is it reminds me that the book is such a kind of an oral experience. It's so kind of sound heavy, there's a lot of dialogue. It's very rich in kind of colloquialism, swearing, and things like that. And it's really a great read. And I think, before I read it, I asked my 11-year-old son to read it, and he went through it very fast, and he loved every second, and then snapped the book shut. I hadn't even started, and said, "I think it's a series." And I was like, "Is it? I haven't looked into it." And now I know it's a series. I know Brittle Paper already put it up. Your new, this next one is called Our Lady of Mysterious Ailments. And the series is to be called Edinburgh Nights. Can you tell me a bit what this series is about?
Right. kudos to your son for reading it at the age of 11. I hope he's learned some new shit in there,
Yeah.
Yeah, the series. So my planning of it, it's going to be an arc of 5 novels. That's going to be like the core thing. And so in the first book, it's an introduction to the world and kind of how messed up it is. But as we go along, I mean, a lot of the series plays around with Scottish history projected into the future, and in a sense, sort of like I was looking at ideas from the Scottish Enlightenment, which is a really interesting sort of like historical period.
Wow.
So you are going to get more villainous villains. It's a really fun series. You've mentioned something about the voice, that it's full of is it colloquialisms or colloquialisms?
I have no idea.
Maybe a native speaker will help us somewhere there. But yeah, it plays around with language. But ultimately, however the reader approaches it, I want them to have fun and to enjoy that kind of roller coaster as the series progresses. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there an echo to my own voice?
There is no echo, but if you're getting an echo from me, I've got these headphones ready, just in case. And I only got them because I had this event with Wole Talabi some time ago on this gaming website called Second Life. Unfortunately, even though I got the headphones, I froze out and really couldn't take part. But is that any better?
Yeah, if you will turn up your volume more, that would be better. The echo is gone.
Okay.
There it is. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So let me. That's just funny that you and Wole Talabi were doing events in Second Life. Of course you were, right? That's super fun. So I wanna ask. Just want to try to connect this to your previous work, which is not speculative fiction, which is not dystopic or magical or things like that. And I think Library of the Dead is sort of, it's great reading for me, but I think it's definitely seems targeted to a young adult readership. Why did you switch readerships in a way?
All right, that's a really interesting sort of question. Because when you think about it, and most authors I know like playing around with genre, because I look at genre as sort of like this narratological device that you use to signal something to the reader about the story that you're telling. So when a story comes to me, I often think about the form that I'm going to be working in. So, for example, The Hairdresser of Harare plays around a lot with genre chick lit and romance novels. It's the Maestro, the Magistrate, and the Mathematician. My second novel uses different tricks and borrows from sort of like other literary novels. So when I look at a story, I think, okay, what is the best way to tell this story? But I understand the question that you speak, which we can probably have a long discussion about the publishing industry, because I remember when after The Hairdresser of Harare was published, there were all these questions: are you going to do a sequel? I remember, pitching my second novel to my Scottish publisher, being called in for a meeting and a free lunch, and he went, Tendai, readers will only give you a certain range. We did very well with The Hairdresser, and I think we should do something similar as opposed to something that is so radically different. And I understand those considerations, because while for us at this end of the spectrum, we're creating art, for the publisher, it's business, right? They have to make money to keep the lights on off those books. And so sometimes you have these two sort of like, they're not necessarily antithetical, but these two sort of like opposing impulses, right? And so I won't begrudge them that. But for me, my artistic impulses lead somewhere else. And so from that lesson, I realized pretty early on that if I wanted to be doing different stuff, it's something that I would have to establish Fortunately, and Wole again, he talked about sort of like he gave an overview of sort of like African sci-fi, which was really interesting, and he also mentioned Ivo Hartman and Afro SF, that sort of like landmark anthology, and so Ivo invited me to do a story, and this almost shows you that for a lot of African authors, those bifurcations of genre don't quite apply. I mean, Leia Denle, who's a fantastic crime novelist, is releasing The Dark Side of the Moon this year, which is a wonderful fantasy sci-fi crossover novel. So you've got all these different authors that are doing like interesting things across multiple genres, and for me, because when I was in school, this is the stuff that I enjoyed reading. But you will notice, and you introduced me as Tendai L. Huchu, that I publish sort of mainstream realist fiction as Tendai Huchu and genre fiction as TL Huchu, so that if you want Marmite, you won't get Nutella.
Wow. Okay, I didn't notice that there was that subtle authorship shift. That's very interesting. I think part of the reason I also asked the question was I was on Goodreads, the website, and when the audience interacts with Hairdresser of Harare, it's always like this novel about bleak, dark, difficult times in Harare, and then when it's about Library of the Dead, people will say, oh, is Ropa queer? What's her sexuality and things like that. And it's just like you see, like the engagement is just completely altered, in a way. And that's, of course, the difficulties that embedded within receptions of African writing, or what is perceived as African literature versus not, and so on. One of the things that was, one of the reviews about this of Library of the Dead called your book urban supernatural fantasy blended with apocalyptic dystopia. And I think these terms, big words, resonated for me, but they also made me ask about its location, which is Edinburgh. And I've never been there, so I can't tell what the intervention necessarily is for this particular city, right? But we know that speculative fiction builds sometimes fictitious world, that it's this kind of fictitious world making activity, but you're building this world within Edinburgh. And even though it's set in this kind of apocalyptic time, future time, or non-time, something is going on there with the location. And then the series is also Edinburgh Nights. What are you doing with this city?
Well, what we're doing there, so urban, we're in a city. That's not much of an issue. Supernatural, we've got ghosts, so that kind of works. Dystopian. Now, I understand why people refer refer to this book as something dystopian, right? Because what they see is radically different from their idea of Edinburgh. I think everyone who's sort of like heard of Edinburgh, it's this quaint, touristy, historical city with clean streets
and posh, very posh, whereas Ropa is living on the other side of the town, right?
And very posh, right? And so there is the old town and the new town in Edinburgh, which are right in the center. That's your postcard Edinburgh that you get. But I'll just take you back a bit and sort of like show you the logic of what I'm working with. So the book is set slightly into the future. You know this because everyone kind of goes around saying, God save the king. And you have to respond, long may he reign. Now, we know there's been a British queen for the last 50 odd years, right? So you know it's after that time period. When exactly, it doesn't say. The fact that you have to respond in a certain way shows you that it is a slightly dystopic type of future Edinburgh. Some people have called the book an alternate history. I don't know, because I'm drawing from real history that actually happened. Now, when people play around with time in in novels, usually what happens is there's these lips, or or they go forward and back in sort of like chronological time, right? And try to break down that idea of linear time. How I do it in this particular book is to use the location. So, for example, if you go back, say pre the Union, right? So Scotland was its own independent kingdom until 1707, where it joined the Union of Great Britain and Ireland, which now is only Northern Ireland, because the Republic of Ireland left in the 20s, or was it the 30s? I'm not too sure on that. So Scotland was its own independent kingdom, and there was something kind of like a crazy situation, because in 1603 you had the Scottish King James VI, I think, who became James I in England. So he held the crowns of both these separate and distinct nations, but Scotland pretty much was a separate nation. Everyone understood Scotland as a different place, even though they shared the same king. And this persisted for about 100 years before there was a formal political union. Now, at the time, Scotland was the poorest nation in Western Europe. It's what Trump would have called a shithole country, and I think his mum or his grandma came from here, so that kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Edinburgh, historical Edinburgh, the Edinburgh that they sell you now, which is this quaint, posh place, the historical Edinburgh was dirty, smelly. People threw human excrement out the windows, right? You could get murdered. There were prostitutes everywhere. And Scotland was like a real poor nation until it joined the Union and became, started enjoying the proceeds from the English Empire, which became the British Empire. So there's all these things that are happening. So the Edinburgh that you find then, and what I've done a lot is, for example, there's these gardens in the city center called Princess Street Gardens. There used to be what they called a loch, which is a water body that got so smelly because people were dumping rubbish in it. They drained it to have these gardens. But in my book, the loch is back. So I'm trying to show the reader that we are talking of a history that's set in the future. And the reason I do these things is we have this idea of linear time, right? But when you think about it, is it not a strange thing that theater exists next to radio, next to television, next to the internet? I mean, if you wrote a book that had all those things, someone would say, well, theater would be obsolete. What's it doing? Who would listen to radio if you have this wonderful thing with pictures? And now you've got your streaming, right? So the world that we live in, with all these different layers of time, and maybe this is from my own Zimbabwean background, where you can move from Harare, which is a fairly modern city with electricity that works, sometimes it doesn't, running water and all those things. But if you move 20 minutes out of town, there's people that are living in traditional mud huts, living a traditional agrarian lifestyle, right? And when you do that in a setting like Edinburgh, people say, oh my God, it's dystopian, right? But the Edinburgh that I'm showing is an Edinburgh that's only dystopian if you say New Delhi, Hanoi, Sao Paulo, all those places are dystopian.
Exactly.
What you're seeing is a country that benefited from empire, that became wealthy, but all nations decline over time. That is kind of inevitable, right? You have a good run, you make a lot of money, you plunder, and then you fall. That's set in stone. If unless we've reached a point where human history never repeats itself.
Right.
But when you have that fall, and there are reasons in the text as the series progresses for what happens. So all the reader knows now is there was an event called the catastrophe. It's not really delineated, but there's signs that there was violence. There was a cataclysmic event that changed things. But when that happens, you then sort of like revert to a state where, okay, so you still have electric vehicles on the street, but they're next to horse-drawn carriages. So the images that you get there are pretty jarring, but there is an internal logic. Am I making any sense at all here?
Absolutely. It's just the only journey I'm going on is very theoretical. So I'm trying to cull my own own thoughts, because you're saying so many interesting, exciting things. And I suspected that you are attempting a kind of historical intervention, because Thomas Carlyle appears right at the beginning, and then other historians show up and things like that. So you're doing this kind of rich intertextual.
And that's why we start sort of like in the cottage. The McGregors live in the cottage that Thomas Carlyle did his honeymoon. Right. And it's almost to show that the honeymoon period of like the flourishing of 300 years of empire is over. But Carlyle is very problematic. If you know about Thomas Carlyle and his ideas on race and stuff. So it's almost a hint of the things that are playing out in the novel, but
yeah,
I try to do it a little subtly. So if you know sort of like the history, then it will make a lot more sense. But we are working towards something.
Yeah, and I think very, very differently, you and Wanjiku are actually doing something similar, which is engaging the notion of places that were, either colonized or were on the margins of empire, which is the case with Scotland, whichever way we cut it. I mean, it's in a very odd position. Now, within that, you're bringing in Ropa, who's Zimbabwean, and who is who's a hustler or smartass, but she's also like a carer, and she's very curious, and she's on the verge of becoming very powerful, and part of like the heritage thread with her through the grandmother and so on is Zimbabwean, right? And I just maybe before I go into that sort of asking about Zimbabwe and so on, maybe you can talk a little bit about the inspiration behind this very exciting character. She's very unique, very cool looking, cool attitude. What brought you to her?
Well, so Ropa, again, sort of, I started this off, and I had a long period doing short fiction, SFF short fiction, and I did a piece called Ghost Stoker that was set in my own hometown of Bindura. I think it was published around 2014-15 in a small e-zine called Electric Spec, and it had this proto-Ropa, this girl who talks to ghosts. She didn't even have a name. And she was just doing it again for money, right? But in 2017, I did another short story called The Library of the Dead, which was kind of like a proto-library that was set in Harare. So that's kind of like the antecedent, if that's the right word for, or at least the proto version of this particular one. So when I started thinking of doing a novel, because the voice, it was all about the voice, the voice of that girl from Ghost Stoker really stayed with me. And because it was such a strong, sharp, powerful voice. And over time I thought, okay, how am I going to do this story? Right. Now I could set it in sort of like I could set it in Zimbabwe, which creates a different story because we use a different history and stuff. I could set it in Edinburgh, the city. So I opted for Edinburgh simply because I wanted sort of like a larger canvas to draw on. And Edinburgh has this thing where, geographically, I mean, it's only a city of about 400,000 people, which is a large town. It's you couldn't compare it to a place like Lagos, right, which is massive. But it has this depth of the history that's so easily excavatable. So when I was doing Ropa now, because the character shifted locations, she expresses herself slightly differently from the story that I originally set out to create. So, and this is just in observations of my friends with kids here who kind of speak with these weird Scottish type accents, and I'm like, yo, what is going on here? So there's a playfulness with language, right? Which is she uses a lot of slang that is common. I mean, even sort of like Americanisms, London slang, that kind of thing. There's certain terms that infuse because that's youth culture, that's hip, that's hot, that's cool. She uses Scots, which is kind of the dialect that you find here in Edinburgh. She also uses a bit of Shona because of the influences of her grandmother, and so I was trying to do something that was kind of like sonically interesting, a character whose language pulls in all sorts of different directions, right? So she's very potty mouthed, as they say here, and sweary.
but she'll also get deep into like really interesting scientific theory because she's a bit of prodigy in a sense. And what I wanted to go against is there's this sort of like really simple kind of, I don't want to call it stereotyping, right? But this simplicity that if someone is from X place, then we assume they're this or that. When a lot of people are complex, we now live in a world where, you know, if Twitter and all those places and sort of like I also blame American academia to be believed, then I will wake up in the morning and say, oh, I am a marginalized black guy from, you know, Africa and blah blah blah. These are my boxes, and therefore I'll go forth in the world and behave like that.
Right.
But human beings, when you meet them in life, they're a lot messier than that. You can't just say, okay, they're this, therefore they behave in this way. I mean, Theo was talking about country music being a thing in Zimbabwe when she was growing up, right? But if you were going through your stereotype of what Zimbabwe is, you wouldn't think Don Williams and Dolly Parton would be hot there. And so when creating character, all these sort of like things that appear maybe contradictory are really, really important, because when you get to know people, they go far beyond those little boxes that we like to stick them in.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in India, and it's just the same thing around music and references there as well. And even though the generation now is really hooked into what's new, and they're on social media, and they're not listening to old weird things, you can end up in a bar or a restaurant where it is from another time. It is back in that strange atemporal weird place where you're listening to like Michael Jackson's Bad or something like that, as if it just came out. So I completely understand this kind of hybrid world, this complex world that you're talking about. One of the things I enjoyed also about the book that you're somewhat addressing is that this is a multicultural Edinburgh, right? So there's Ropa, there's Jomo, there's Priya, and also there's all these kind of cultural heritage elements like the Mambira that that is utilized, and so and then just the way the kinship, the bonds between the people, they are I suspect they are not kind of Western in some way. They're not Western. I don't know what I even perhaps mean by that. But the question I have is, this particular genre now that you're writing in, this young adult or fantasy, whatever word we want to use for it, speculative fiction, tends to be very white, right? And so I wonder if you are deliberately in occupation mode. Are you occupying this space through the type of cultural world you're creating in this? Are you occupying this literary marketplace? I think you are. I just wondered how conscious you are as you do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting, right? When we think about it, that when we say multicultural, now places that are culturally not diverse are actually very, very, very rare. There's this wonderful woman called Lisa Williams in Edinburgh who does these Black History walks, and if you walk with her for 2 hours, she'll show you places where Black people have historically been living in sort of like in Edinburgh for years. I mean, it's almost one of those curious things that when you walk, you're like, oh, I know these spaces, but I didn't know them like that. And it seems like it's a new thing, but the mixing happens all the time. I mean, and I find it in my own cultural context, right, where I'm Zimbabwean and I'm Shona, but some of the friends that I just by default assumed are Shona like me because we either went to school together or stuff, then they start telling you, no, that their mom came from Zambia, or their parents were from Malawi and stuff. So I'm completely against the idea of any sort of like cultural purity. That's complete and utter bollocks, because if any culture was truly pure, then all you would get is stasis. But sort of going to the industry and what it is I'm doing, I think for years, if you think about the publishing industry, white people benefited from what is the ultimate affirmative action, right? So in the sense that I'll tell you about, my second novel, and Lizzy knows this story that, we sent out to a particular publisher, and the response was, we like it, it's beautifully written, but we've already got a black author, I think, was it an African author that, that we've got, so we can't take it. So in that sense, you say to yourself, okay, if a publisher looks at the literary merit of something and they say, is this good writing? Is it a compelling story? And they pass on it, right? You can go away and write a better story and come back next time. But if they say to you, well, we've just looked at your ethnicity and we've already got like our token black person, what are you going to do? Are you going to Michael Jackson it and come back looking white and stuff? That's a dead end, right? So you've got all this stuff, and I was really thinking about this as Wole Talabi was talking about sort of like the evolution of African SFF, in the sense that what writers produce and what you find marketed to you or sold to you are two very different things, right? Because if there's no spaces, no outlets for them, you could have had like hundreds of sci-fi, hard sci-fi writers in the 60s and 70s, but they would never have gotten a shot. And if you listen to Samuel Delaney, the African story of how difficult it is just for African Americans to get published. So it was never a level playing field. And now we kind of look at it and we're like, oh, hooray, there's representation and all that. Like, we're supposed to be grateful for that shit. Fuck that. That's complete and utter bollocks. Because now that the works are coming out, right, and people are reading them and they're selling them. So it's not exact. I mean, most readers are pretty gregarious, right? They enjoy stuff. If it's a well-written, compelling story. I mean, I got hooked on 19th century Russian literature in my 20s. None of that stuff was ever written for me. I don't think Dostoevsky or Tolstoy were thinking about a Zimbabwean boy from Bindura, right? So when the stuff is there, readers grab it. Same with Black Panther. We're like, yay, Black Panther. But you could have done it ages ago. Hell, you had Blade that was hot. But after that, there was a dead end, right? We've had our black guy moment, and now it's... And this is almost like the tragedy when you think about the industry, in the sense that maybe if they're one black person that they take on or whatever sells, then maybe they might consider getting another. But if it flops, but and to go back to the example of sort of like my earlier publisher who refused my second work, there's equally within the same stable, there's a guy that I love who's in the publishing house who was doing these works that are stylistically and thematically really different. And so I go to his launch because he's my friend, and he's like, oh, I'm so happy to be with Freight Books because, they allow me to play around and to try different things. I'm like, we're with the same, I had a different conversation. So I've rambled on now. I've forgotten.
No, you know what? I'm excited by this ramble because shameless self-promotion here, but I transitioned from editing Warscapes to full-fledgedly now doing Radical Books Collective, which is very much attempting to decenter this literary marketplace, because over the years, yes, my salary is paid by my professor job, but my whole group of friends are all writers and they're all trying to get publishing deals and agent deals. And they're all writers from various countries, non-white and so on. So, and just the pain and just the extent to which publishing and editing and review circuits are so unable to accommodate the multiplicity and the world and things that are changing. And it's just these are painful stories in the end. And the big presses, they continue to have like all the algorithms on on social media, online. So even if we have spaces of freedom or technically open spaces like the digital and so on, the gatekeeping still continues and there's still low access. So to me, the publishing industry is the last bastion, actually, that hasn't been, decolonized or, transformed in any way. And this is a huge issue. We recently had Jennifer Makumbi in our book club, and somebody asked her about, why do we not know very much about this character, because the character is doing something very drastic in the book. And she said, oh, actually, they cut that section because they were like, the novel would be too long, So these kinds of, this extent of power, and it skews the novel. It's still a great novel, but it skewed something, and these compromises, all of this, I feel very strongly about it. So I'm glad to hear you ramble, but we're also, and rage, not just ramble, but rage. I wanted to end with a final question, because we have all the writers still in the studio, and I was hoping you can all take a grand standing ovation. But again and again, if you look at this book, and even inside, it says this is Sixth Sense meets Stranger Things, and Stranger Things. Sure, Sixth Sense, that kid is very droopy, man. That kid is very down and dull. And it's not a reference that necessarily works for me, though I see the connection. I just wanted to ask you, what were your many inspirations? What books did you read? What films inspired you towards this series?
For this series, I sort of, when I was thinking about the form, and it's there is a time as a writer where your influences start to blur because you read a lot. But I've admitted before that I pinched sort of like the schema from Ben Aronovich's Rivers of London series, right? Which is, it's I call it a form of cultural appropriation. I stole it from a white guy who was writing about a black character in London, and so that was a thing for the form of it. In terms of the magic system and the history, there's a lot of different things. There's this wonderful book called The Scottish Enlightenment by Arthur Hammond, which is mentioned within the text that I used. Cinematically, Sixth Sense, that ghost thing is pretty dope, and I watched it and enjoyed it. So it might actually really be in there, and I can get some of these sort of like comparisons that marketing people do, because they always try to pin things to something that is very well known, even if the work is trying to do something slightly different. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I am going to stop here, and I am going to because I have this view here of people in the backstage. I'm going to I'm going to beam everybody up. We can take our little selfies or whatever, screenshots. So, and we can say goodbye. We've had a fantastic viewership. Massive thanks to Africa as a Country for beating it to their many, many, many followers. And Brittle Paper, we've lost Ainehi for the moment, but that's okay. I'm going to say a huge thank you. I'm going to say a huge thank you to Lizzy for the wonderful conversation. I want to say a huge thanks to our social media and design person, Pritika Nanda, who made that fabulous video and all those things, and to Ainehi for the conversation. And then I'm going to take me and Lizzy off, and I'm going to show you, have you all say goodbye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Bye. Yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah,
Really
yeah. Lovely meeting you all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.